Chapter 275. World Photography Competition Exhibition. This award was very prestigious and professional, but it was too professional. Therefore, when the winners of the competition were announced, it didn't cause much of a stir on the internet. After all, compared to breaking news like a celebrity's infidelity, professional news was indeed too niche. Lin Xian said that Chen Shi and his wife were now online because of this photo titled Lovers, which really amazed many photography enthusiasts and insiders. Photography was the same as painting, it was to show static beauty to the world. But the difference between photography and painting was that painting could be created at will, while photography honestly recorded everything that happened at the time. The scenes shown in the photos were also scenes that had once appeared in this world. The selection method of the photography award was nothing more than the evaluation of the theme, scene composition, exposure, tone, clarity, and several other aspects. The reason why this photo won first place in the professional portrait category was entirely because the couple in the photo was too dazzling. Just like a war photographer taking photos of refugees on the battlefield, the subject matter itself was a bonus. It was a kind of luck to be able to meet such an outstanding model in the vast sea of people, but the art of photography sometimes really did require a certain amount of luck. Weren't many world-famous classic photos captured by photographers by chance? Therefore, although the photographer named Sun Yuanyuan's skills were mediocre, she still managed to stand out from the rest of the entries and become a celebrity in the circle. And now, wasn't this award-winning photo on display at London's Somerset Palace? After Chen Shi showed the news he found on the internet to Qin Ruoying, the couple didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seemed that they had to pay more attention to protecting their portrait rights in the future. They didn't want to be online, so this kind of feeling of putting their photos on the internet for the world to see, it was a bit strange. However, since they had already given it, it was too late for regrets. Therefore, the couple could only adjust their mood and completely forget about this matter. Later, the couple accompanied the little girl to watch cartoons for a while, and then went out to find Lin Xian to catch up. The lunch location was chosen by Lin Xian. It was a Western restaurant with a good reputation, and was very friendly. The restaurant's location was good. It was on the edge of the Dianjiang River. Sitting in the outdoor seats outside the restaurant, one could overlook the entire Dianjiang River. Perhaps it was because it was close to the business district, so when Chen Shi's family arrived at the restaurant, there were already many business people in formal attire sitting there. Everyone was sitting by the river, admiring the beautiful scenery while discussing work. It could be considered a small bourgeois atmosphere. Ying here, as soon as Chen Shi's family arrived at the restaurant, Lin Xian stood on the steps and waved at them excitedly. It had to be said that Lin Xian's outfit today was very eye-catching. As a professional woman who has lived in the CBD business circle for a long time, Lin Xian wore a dark blue dress and a well-cut long trench coat today. In addition, she had combed her short blonde hair into a bob with bangs, which not only reflected the capable temperament of an urban white-collar woman, but also had a unique charm of a mature woman. It was simply a beautiful scenery on the banks of the Dianjiang River. After Qin Ruoying heard Lin Xian's shout, she immediately waved at her. At this time, the little girl lying in Chen Shi's arms finally saw Lin Xian, so she immediately waved her little hand and shouted at Lin Xian happily, "Sister! Sister!" As she shouted, she also motioned for Chen Shi to put her down. After Chen Shi put her down, the little girl took a step and ran toward Lin Xian. Lin Xian squatted on the ground and gently hugged the little girl in her arms. Then she pinched her little face and asked, "Nian Nian, how have you been recently? Did you miss sister?" "Sister, I miss you so much." The little girl's mouth was so sweet that it immediately made Lin Xian giggle. After all, this little thing had said before that she liked Lin Xian, so when she saw Lin Xian again, she was naturally very close to her. Seeing their daughter acting coquettishly in someone else's arms, the couple didn't mean to be jealous at all. Instead, they couldn't help but smile. When the two of them came closer, Lin Xian let go of the little girl, then got up and hugged Qin Ruoying intimately. After the hug, she said very exaggeratedly, "Ying, long time no see, I missed you so much. Io, how did you become so beautiful again?" Hearing this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but smile and ask, "You have such a sweet mouth, who did you learn it from?" Qin Ruoying hadn't seen Lin Xian for a long time. She originally thought that after so many years, she and Lin Xian's relationship would be much more distant. But she didn't expect that after meeting again, Lin Xian still gave her a very close feeling. Perhaps, this was the so-called best friend? The two of them greeted each other. Then, Lin Xian pulled Qin Ruoying directly to a chair at the side, and then began to ask her where she had been all these years. This question really troubled Lin Xian for a long time. So much so that she even had some thoughts that she shouldn't have. But fortunately, these were all just thoughts that had just sprouted. But these thoughts were all strangled in the cradle by her in a timely manner. Therefore, when Lin Xian saw Qin Ruoying again, she couldn't wait to know the cause and effect. And regarding this problem, the couple had already discussed the countermeasures, so Qin Ruoying immediately made up a lie that was born out of the truth. The general meaning was, her family didn't agree to her marriage with Chen Shi, so she could only abandon her husband and daughter and return to her hometown. These years she didn't have a very good life. It wasn't until Chen Shi came to her hometown to find her that her family was moved by Chen Shi's sincerity and finally approved this marriage. The story wasn't very complicated, but Lin Xian couldn't help but frown slightly after hearing it. Ying, what era is this? Your family still pays attention to the words of the parents and the matchmaker? Why do I feel that with your personality? You shouldn't be so obedient to your family. Are you lying to me? Hearing this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but smile and ask, "Oh? Then tell me, why would I lie to you? I can't say it, but I keep feeling a little weird. I don't really believe what you said just now. What I said is the truth. If you don't believe me, then I can't help it." Okay. Seeing that Lin Xian nodded suspiciously, Qin Ruoying decisively changed the topic and took the initiative to ask, Xian, what about you? How have you been these few years? Are you married? Do you have children? Hearing this, Lin Xian's expression couldn't help but stiffen, but quickly returned to normal. After forcing a smile, she replied in a seemingly relaxed tone, "Not yet, but I can tell you a piece of good news." What good news? Chapter 276. Engagement? After Lin Xian's voice fell, even Chen Shi, who was next to her, could not help but turn his head to look at her. It had only been about half a year since the last time they parted at the dock. Who would have thought that Lin Xian was going to get engaged? Who is it? Do I know him? Qin Ruoying threw out a series of questions, but Lin Xian smiled and shook her head after listening. She responded, "You don't know him." At this time, Chen Shi could not help but interrupt and ask, "Is it Li Xiuwen?" No matter what, Li Xiuwen had pursued Lin Xian for a long time. In addition, Wang Lu had been playing matchmaker and constantly putting good words for him in front of Lin Xian. So, if this lucky guy was Li Xiuwen, Chen Shi would not be surprised at all. However, what Chen Shi did not expect was, when he mentioned Li Xiuwen's name, Lin Xian still shook her head and replied calmly, "You don't know him either." "Oh, okay." Chen Shi nodded, then sat on the side and didn't say anything. In fact, after hearing the news that Lin Xian was going to get engaged, Chen Shi was also happy for Lin Xian from the bottom of his heart. After all, Lin Xian was not young anymore. It was hard enough for her to work alone in Zhonghai for so many years. If she could find someone to rely on, it would be a good thing for her. As for Lin Xian's little thoughts, it was obviously impossible for Chen Shi not to know. It was just that this kind of thing felt a little awkward just thinking about it, so he could only pretend to be confused. Qin Ruoying did not know the little secret in Lin Xian's heart, so she continued to ask curiously, "You're going to get engaged? How long have you been together?" "It's been almost 4 months." "What? Only 4 months?" Qin Ruoying was truly shocked by Lin Xian's words. Based on her understanding of Lin Xian should be very cautious when it came to relationships, so she really couldn't imagine how outstanding that man was to be able to get Lin Xian to the point where they were talking about marriage in just a few months. Xian, marriage is not child's play. You've only known each other for a few months, and you're already engaged. What's the difference between this and a flash marriage? Wasn't the most common ending of a flash marriage a flash divorce? Especially for women, if they were so careless about marriage, they would be completely irresponsible for their own future. Qin Ruoying wanted to persuade Lin Xian to reconsider. However, Lin Xian seemed to have thought of everything. She smiled and gestured for her not to worry. Then she said, Ying, don't worry. I'm not a little girl anymore. Do you think I'll be blinded by love? When I said that I was about to get engaged, there was actually a prerequisite. What prerequisite? He has to pass my strict test. Lin Xian couldn't help but blink playfully. Seeing that Qin Ruoying was still confused, she smiled and explained, we're classmates. Your daughter is already so old, but I'm still single. How can I not be anxious? How can my family not be anxious? Even if you're anxious, you can't be so careless. Qin Ruoying rolled her eyes at Lin Xian in exasperation. Seeing this, Lin Xian held onto her hand and patiently explained. Ying, listen to me. Actually, what I mean is that I'm not young anymore. Since I agreed to date someone, it's obvious that I'm aiming for marriage. Grandpa Mao once said that those who don't date for the purpose of marriage are all hooligans. So I have to carefully examine him. If he can successfully pass my examination, then why can't I marry him? Qin Ruoying was speechless. After hesitating for a long time, she asked with a puzzled expression, Xian, do you love him? Love. Hearing this, Lin Xian couldn't help but chuckle. Ying, you might not know. How difficult is it to meet someone you like in this world who also likes you? Actually, a lot of people can only choose one of two. You can either choose the one you like or the one who likes you. I think I'm still very rational, so I choose the latter. Saying this, Lin Xian couldn't help but glance at Chen Shi. She seemed to be envious of the relationship between the couple. Seeing that Lin Xian had already said this, Qin Ruoying naturally couldn't say anything else. Therefore, after hesitating for a while, she could only sincerely wish her well. Okay, although it's still a little rushed, I believe in your taste, so I wish you happiness in advance. All the best, Xian. Thank you. Perhaps because this topic was a little heavy, the two quickly changed the topic, and then chatted about everything. Qin Ruoying hadn't talked so much in a long time. After all, she didn't have many friends, and Lin Xian was one of the few that she had left. Therefore, after lunch, Chen Shi's family didn't rush to leave. Instead, they continued to accompany Lin Xian for afternoon tea. In the end, because Lin Xian received a call from her leader, saying that there was an urgent matter that required her to return to the company, Lin Xian could only reluctantly say goodbye to Chen Shi's family. Sister, goodbye. Lin Xian had just treated the little guy to a lot of desserts, which made the little guy very happy. Therefore, even though Chen Shi had already walked a distance away with her in his arms, the little guy still reluctantly turned back and waved at Lin Xian. Nian, goodbye, sister will treat you to good food next time, come moi. Goodbye, sister. Hearing this, the little guy covered her mouth with both hands, gave Lin Xian a flying kiss, and then obediently returned to Chen Shi's arms. Lin Xian stood by the street. Until Chen Shi's family got into the car and left, she didn't leave. Just like that afternoon last year. It was a beautiful September day, and the pier was quiet. She stood under the palm tree, just like today, watching the car gradually disappear into the distance. Lin Xian was slightly absent-minded, but at this moment, a feminine man's voice suddenly sounded from behind her. Xian, I've been waiting by the side for so long, but you didn't even give me a chance to go on stage? Let me tell you, I'm angry. Lin Xian turned back to look, only to see a gay-looking man in tight pants, walking quickly towards her with a resentful expression. Seeing this, Lin Xian complained helplessly. Didn't I tell you to wear a suit? Look at you, how can I introduce you to my friend? Xian, I've said it many times. I don't like, wear, or pretend. What's wrong with me wearing this? Why can't you introduce me to your friend? Hearing this, Lin Xian could only sigh, and turn to apologize to him. All right, it's my fault, I shouldn't have asked you to come. I apologize to you, don't be angry, okay? I'm not happy. I'm a little angry. All right, I'll treat you to coffee, don't be angry. Saying this, Lin Xian went up to the man's arm, and pulled him to a nearby coffee shop. As they walked, Lin Xian tilted her head to look at the sea not far away. The afternoon sun shone on the surface of the sea, as if the sea was coated with a layer of gold powder. The sparkling waves were almost blinding. In a daze, Lin Xian's thoughts drifted further and further away. Actually, she didn't know what she was thinking about. She asked herself, she wasn't a chaste woman. But why couldn't her heart hold anyone else? Why? What was the reason? Lin Xian really wanted to know the answer. But Chapter 277. After a short reunion with Lin Xian, Qin Ruoying's mood became very happy. Although they hadn't seen each other for many years, after this afternoon's conversation, she was finally sure that there wasn't much of a gap between her and Lin Xian. They were still friends who could talk to each other. This was undoubtedly good news for Qin Ruoying. After all, human beings were social animals. Even if Qin Ruoying's temperament was outstanding, she still needed a few close friends to accompany her. The family of three was in a good mood. Therefore, since getting on the car, the little fellow had been sitting on her knees by the window in the back row, stretching out her head to look at the scenery outside the window. When she saw a gift shop on the street, she couldn't take her eyes off it. Because in the gift shop's cabinet facing the street, there was actually a huge teddy bear. The little fellow liked teddy bears very much, but she had never had a teddy bear of her own. So she immediately put her little hand on the window, pointed at the teddy bear in the distance and said, "Papa, I want that." The little fellow pulled Chunxi's arm, indicating that Chunxi should look in the direction she pointed. How sharp were Chunxi's eyes! With just a casual glance from the corner of his eyes, he already understood what the little fellow wanted. But, when Chunxi saw what the little fellow wanted, he didn't promise to buy it for her. Instead, he pretended to be puzzled, as if he didn't see what the little fellow was pointing at. After the little girl anxiously shouted a few words, Chunxi put on an act and moved her head closer to the little girl. Then, she looked in the direction the little girl was pointing at. "Nian, what do you want? Why didn't Papa see it?" That. Over there. Papa, look. Bear. Big bear. I want that. Big bear." In a moment of excitement, the little fellow couldn't even speak clearly. "Where? Come, let me see again." Chunxi continued to pretend that he did not see anything. There was only one reason why he was acting like a fool, and that was, he didn't want to buy the teddy bear for the little girl at all. Of course, the reason why Chunxi didn't want to buy a teddy bear for the little guy was obviously not because of money, but because he was now thinking from the perspective of a parent. After all, the child was still young and had no sense of propriety. If he blindly obeyed the child, he would unknowingly hurt the child. Of course, this kind of damage was hidden. The so-called obedience was actually a disguised form of doting. This was also a taboo question for Chunxi. That was why he pretended to be crazy in order to fool them. The roads in the city were very crowded, so the taxi moved very slowly. However, no matter how slow the car was, when the green light came on, the taxi would still slowly move forward with the traffic. Therefore, after Chunxi pretended to dawdle for a while, the gift shop completely disappeared from the little fellow's sight. Looking at the teddy bear that she was so fond of disappearing, the little fellow immediately leaned on the back of the chair and pouted. No matter how Chunxi talked to her, she just turned her head and didn't say a word. Well, she was angry again. The couple looked at each other, and both of them couldn't help shaking their heads and laughing. The child's temper was getting worse and worse recently. If it went on like this, maybe she would be spoiled by them in the future? Although they didn't speak, they reached a consensus through their eyes. It was time to strangle this evil trend. The taxi continued to drive. After the little fellow's performance, the sunny sky just now unknowingly darkened at the moment. A large dark cloud appeared out of nowhere and hung over the city. It was as if it had suddenly dragged everyone from the sunny afternoon to the dark night. The street lights on both sides of the street continued to light up, and the cars on the road also turned on their headlights. The taxi driver stuck his head out of the window and looked up at the dark sky. He couldn't help but mutter in Zhonghai dialect, "It's going to rain." But what the driver didn't expect was that as soon as he finished speaking, bean-sized raindrops fell from the sky like a torrential downpour, hitting the whole car with a pitter-patter sound. A torrential rain began without any warning. This rain was very heavy. It was probably the heaviest rain that Chunxi had seen since he returned to Earth. Because the rain was too heavy, even if the driver adjusted the windshield wipers to the highest gear, he still couldn't see the front clearly. The taxi struggled to move forward in the pouring rain. According to common sense, a heavy rainstorm like this was usually a sudden shower, and it should soon clear up. But today's rain was beyond everyone's expectations. After going through untold hardships, the taxi finally brought Chen-shi and his family back to the Kongju district. The rain didn't lessen at all, but became heavier and heavier. The rain poured down, and the wind howled. Because he didn't want to be too conspicuous, Chen-shi took off his coat and held Qin Ruoying by the corner, temporarily using the coat as an umbrella. Then, the couple rushed into the rain with the little fellow in their arms. Although Chen-shi's coat was shielding her, the splashing rain continued to hit the little fellow's face. The rain soaked down her neck and soaked into her clothes, but the little thing didn't feel cold at all. Instead, she shouted happily, "Mama, come on. Papa, come on. Run faster. Run faster. We're almost home." The loud sound of the rain completely covered her excited screams. By the time the couple finally ran into the building with the little guy in their arms, the family of 3 had all become drowned rats. Perhaps it was because they hadn't been as embarrassed as today for a long time. So when the couple looked down at the little fellow who was still giggling in Chen-shi's arms, the two of them couldn't help but giggle with the little thing. For a moment, the laughter of the family of 3 successfully covered the sound of the rain outside. But when the family was laughing foolishly, there was a sudden flash of light outside. Then, a series of muffled thunder exploded in the sky. Rumble! The wind and rain blew, and thunder and lightning intertwined. This year's spring thunder seemed to come earlier than in previous years. The deafening thunder continued to sound, and every sound could make the little fellow in Chen-shi's arms tremble with fear. Seeing this, Chen-shi hurriedly hugged the little thing tightly in his arms, and at the same time used his vital essence to block most of the sound for her. And just when Chen-shi was busy comforting the little fellow, Qin Ruoying seemed to have noticed something all of a sudden. She couldn't help but frown slightly. Then, with a puzzled expression, she came to the iron gate of the building and looked up at the gloomy sky. Chapter 278. Spring thunder sounded, and everything grew. The so-called hibernation awakening referred to one of the 24 solar terms of the lunar calendar. This solar term represented that after the beginning of spring, the temperature gradually warmed up, and the spring thunder began to shake. All kinds of hibernating animals hibernating in the soil woke up, and nature was revitalized. It was precisely because of this that this day was called Hibernation Awakening by the ancients. Today happened to be the Hibernation Awakening Day. The thunder rumbled in the sky, and bean-sized raindrops continued to drip from the eaves, like beads with broken strings, and immediately splashed everywhere when they hit the ground. The rain and mist continued, so that the whole world became a foggy scene. After Qin Ruoying stood by the iron gate for a while, Chen-shi came to her with the little girl in his arms. "What's wrong?" "There's an indescribable feeling, it feels weird." Qin Ruoying answered Chen-shi's question while stretching her hand out of the eaves. Looking at the raindrops constantly hitting her hand, Qin Ruoying's doubts in her eyes became stronger. Oh! Although Qin Ruoying couldn't describe her feelings, Chen-shi seemed to be able to understand her after thinking about it, so he immediately asked, "Do you feel that this rain is like a gauze covering your body with a light and comfortable flutter? You feel it too?" Hearing this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but feel happy. She thought it was her own psychological effect, but she didn't expect Chen-shi to feel it too. That feeling. In fact, it was like sleeping with the air conditioner on in summer. It was just that this silk was very large, thin and smooth, giving people a very comfortable feeling. Perhaps because she felt so comfortable, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but want to go into the rain, ready to experience that feeling again. However, just as Qin Ruoying was about to walk out of the eaves, Chen-shi suddenly stopped her. "Ying, go home first, you have to give Nian a bath and change clothes." "All right." After hearing Chen-shi's words, Qin Ruoying suddenly came back to her senses. This storm. It was as if there was a strange magic that made her subconsciously want to stand in the rain. After looking at the storm outside thoughtfully, Qin Ruoying reluctantly followed Chen-shi upstairs and went home. After reaching home, she began to busy herself with bathing the little guy. At this time, Chen-shi took the time to go to the shopping mall not far from the community. While buying groceries, he also bought a set of clothes for the little girl. This little thing was especially naughty when it was bathing. It splashed water and made a fuss. It simply treated bathing as a parent-child game, so it would dawdle for a long time every time. Therefore, when Qin Ruoying finally helped her to take a bath and change into cartoon pajamas for her, she was almost done with dinner. Today's dinner was very simple. Kung Pao chicken, green pepper fried meat, tomato scrambled eggs, plus a winter melon soup. It was the most common family dish. Although the ingredients used for this home-cooked meal were simple and easy to handle, under Chun-Chi's exquisite control, it could be said to be full of color, aroma, and taste. Although the little guy also had many small problems common to children, at the same time, she also had an advantage, which was that she never dawdled when it came to eating. When it came to eating, she would run faster than anyone else. Therefore, just as Qin Ruoying turned off the hairdryer, the little guy with a head of disheveled hair rushed to the side of the coffee table, picked up the spoon, and scooped up the soup. After all, her father's cooking was the best in the world. After dinner, after watching a few episodes of cartoons, it was 8:30 in the evening. Maybe it was because she was too noisy when she was bathing just now, so the little guy's eyelids were already twitching when she was only halfway through the cartoon. When Chun-Chi saw the little guy's sleepy look, he directly carried her to the bedroom. After a few words of coaxing, the little thing fell into a deep sleep. In order to prevent the little guy from being awakened by the thunder, Chun-Chi specially set up a soundproof restriction in the room. When he finished everything, closed the bedroom door and came to the living room, Qin Ruoying was already standing on the balcony and continued to reach out to catch the rain outside. After noticing Chun-Chi's arrival, Qin Ruoying didn't even turn her head and asked directly, "Why does this rain make me feel so refreshed and refreshed?" Hearing this, Chun-Chi didn't immediately answer. Instead, he gently held her lower abdomen with his left hand, then stretched out his right hand and held her hand from below. This shape was very similar to the classic bow pass in the Titanic. Chun-Chi sniffed the faint fragrance from Qin Ruoying's hair. When he was about to answer her question, a sudden clap of thunder exploded in the sky again. Rumble. The thunder was very close. It was like a grenade exploding next to them. It was deafening. Therefore, after the thunder sounded, there was a burst of screams in the community. Many people were afraid of thunder. But fortunately, a thunderstorm of this magnitude might not be seen even once a year. Under normal circumstances, thunderstorms usually didn't last too long. At most, it would completely stop after a few hours. They didn't know what was going on today. This thunderstorm lasted for more than 3 hours, but there was still no sign of it weakening. If this continued, many people would lose sleep tonight. Chun-Chi gently hugged Qin Ruoying. When the rolling thunder finally stopped, he whispered in Qin Ruoying's ear, "The tide is rising." To be honest, Chun-Chi didn't think that there would be a spirit energy tide in a super first-tier international city like Zhonghai. What was even more surprising was, the scale of this spirit energy tide was far greater than the scale caused by the Qinling spirit binding array. The spirit energy contained in it was even denser than the spirit fog in the Sayakin Glacier. Therefore, every drop of rain that fell from the sky contained a lot of spiritual qi of heaven and earth. How was this a simple thunderstorm? This was spiritual liquid from the sky. After briefly explaining to Qin Ruoying what a spirit energy tide was, Chun-Chi took her back to the living room, and then set up a spirit gathering array for her to cultivate. After all, cultivation was a matter of accumulation over a long period of time. Even if this sudden tide of spirit energy couldn't cause Qin Ruoying's realm to advance by leaps and bounds, it could still save her a lot of effort. After all, it was a good thing with no harm. Naturally, she had to cherish this opportunity. The reason why Qin Ruoying wanted to go into the rain just now was that she had succeeded in her cultivation, so she instinctively wanted to go to places with rich spirit energy. Chun-Chi sat cross-legged next to Qin Ruoying until she entered the deepest level of meditation. Then he got up and went to the balcony. The wind and rain were still outside. Chun-Chi stood on the balcony motionlessly, as if he was waiting for something. Sure enough, about an hour later, a deafening clap of thunder rang out from the horizon again. But this time, the instant the thunder rang out, the entire earth seemed to tremble along with it. Chapter 279. Thunder rumbled, and the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Just as the thunder roared, the entire ground shook violently. In just an instant, the pots, bowls, ladles, basins, chandeliers, photo frames, and other small objects in the room began to shake violently. They either fell on the table or fell to the ground, making a series of clanking sounds. An earthquake. Because of the frequent earthquakes in recent years, the people of Huaxia had a much deeper understanding of earthquakes than before. Therefore, the moment the earthquake happened, the entire community seemed to have been awakened from their sleep by the thunder. Countless people screamed, "Earthquake!" as they rushed out of their houses in a panic. There was the sound of dense footsteps in the corridor. Some residents who were taking a shower did not even have time to put on their clothes at this moment. They ran out of their houses wrapped in a bath towel. It was still raining heavily outside, but at this time, no one cared so much. The fleeing crowd surged like a flood and rushed madly toward the gate of the community. In less than 2 minutes, the streets outside the community were already densely packed with people, blocking the entire road. According to historical records, there had never been a destructive earthquake of magnitude 4 or above in the history of Zhonghai. This was because Zhonghai was located in the most stable plate position in the entire Huaxia. It was not in the earthquake zone at all, so let alone a destructive earthquake. Even a weak earthquake of magnitude 2 or 3 would be difficult to occur. But today, the people of Zhonghai experienced what it felt like to be in the middle of an earthquake. In fact, when the Wenchuan earthquake happened that year, Zhonghai, which was thousands of miles away, also felt it and even caused a big commotion. However, that big earthquake happened more than 2,000 kilometers away in the Chuanyu area after all. So it was far from being as real and exciting as today. Based on the strong tremor just now, this earthquake was at least a magnitude 4, 5 or above, reaching at least the level of a medium-strong earthquake. The earthquake didn't last long. It lasted for about 20 seconds. However, it was this short 20 seconds that really made many people feel like they had escaped death. People who had not experienced an earthquake might not be able to imagine what kind of oppressive feeling an earthquake would bring to people. Perhaps it was only when humans faced the wrath of nature that they would realize how insignificant they were. The downpour continued, but none of the people on the streets dared to return to the residential area. Everyone stood pitifully in the rain, looking at each other. That helpless look was as miserable as it could be. But at this moment, another thunderclap exploded in the sky. Rumble! Rumble! The people on the street didn't even have time to cover their ears before the strong tremors appeared again. In such a situation, not to mention the children, even some of the more timid females were completely scared out of their wits at this moment. After their legs trembled, they sat down on the ground and held their heads in their hands as they cried out loud. For a moment, the entire street seemed to have turned into a refugee camp. Even the torrential rain could not suppress the continuous cries from the crowd. While fear, helplessness, cold, and other negative emotions filled the entire street, there was a little fellow who was still sleeping soundly on the bed. Perhaps it was because sleeping in the rain was very comfortable, so this little thing rolled a few times in her sleep in a daze. She wrapped herself in the blanket like a cicada cocoon before continuing to sleep. Qin Ruoying opened her eyes the moment the earthquake happened. She was originally a little worried about whether the earthquake would endanger Nianyan's safety, but after seeing Chen Shi smile and shake his head at her, Qin Ruoying's slightly anxious heart immediately calmed down. As long as Chen Shi was there, she didn't have to worry about her and Nianyan's safety at all. It had to be said that this feeling was very comfortable and at the same time, very reliable. In fact, as long as Chen Shi was there, not only the mother and daughter, but even the residents of this entire street would not be in any danger. After all, Chen Shi was not the kind of indifferent passerby who would not save someone in need. And speaking of which, wasn't it just a shake? What was the big deal? Chen Shi stood on the balcony and looked into the distance motionlessly. It was not until the third aftershock occurred that he suddenly turned around and returned to the living room. After briefly explaining the situation to Qin Ruoying and indicating that she did not have to worry, Chen Shi set up a series of restrictions in the room. Then he directly left the house. He wanted to see what was the difference between this sudden heaven and earth anomaly and the previous two. After all, Chen Shi was not a weather satellite, and he did not have the leisure to explore heaven and earth anomalies, so he had no idea how many heaven and earth anomalies had occurred on Earth. Take the 2 times that he knew. The first time was in the Taklamakan Desert, and the second time was in the Siachen Glacier. Both times, heaven and earth anomalies appeared in the remote border areas. But this time, the heaven and earth anomaly appeared in Zhonghai. In this international metropolis with a total population of as many as 25 million people, one had to know that although ordinary people did not know how to cultivate, as the spirit of all things, humans still instinctively absorb some heaven and earth spirit energy. Even if each person could only absorb a little, with such a large population base, the heaven and earth spirit energy in Zhonghai would naturally become very sparse. In this regard, Zhonghai and Shangjing could not be compared at all. Although the total population of Shangjing was as many as 20 million, Shangjing was the imperial capital of 5 dynasties. The emperors of each dynasty liked to choose Shangjing as their capital. It was precisely because Shangjing itself was a paradise, located at the head of the dragon veins. So no matter how large the population of Shangjing was, Zhonghai still had such rich heaven and earth spirit energy. Therefore, if there was a heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing, Qinshi would not be surprised at all. But the strange thing was that there was no heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing. But in Zhonghai, a new city that had only been prosperous for 100 or 200 years, there was one. How could this not surprise Qinshi? As he flew, Qinshi pondered the question of why there would be a heaven and earth anomaly in Zhonghai. In fact, if you put aside the dragon veins, Zhonghai could really be considered a blessed land. Why? That was because, as a coastal city, Zhonghai rarely had natural disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, and tsunamis since ancient times. It was close to the river, the sea, and the plains, far away from the earthquake zone, and there were multiple island chains in the outer sea to block tsunamis. Such a unique geographical advantage was extremely rare, even in the world. Thinking about it carefully, other than the lack of the dragon veins and the sparse spirit energy, Zhonghai seemed to have no shortcomings. But these were only geographical advantages, and had nothing to do with heaven and earth spirit energy or heaven and earth anomalies. The more Qinshi thought about it, the more confused he became. But at this moment, a flash of inspiration flashed in his mind, and he suddenly thought of a very important question. 5 years ago, wasn't it also during this thunderstorm that he suddenly went from earth to heavenly jade? Thunderstorm? Spirit energy recovery? Heaven and earth anomaly? Heavenly jade world? The moment this question popped up, Qinshi's figure suddenly stopped in midair. His entire body froze. For a long time, it was not until the sound of thunder sounded again that Qinshi seemed to be awakened from his sleep by a gong. He could not help but exclaim. Chapter 280. 5 years ago, Qinshi was just an ordinary person who couldn't be more ordinary. At that time he had dreams, was willing to work hard, and could endure hardships. Although his life was a little shabby, he always thought that he was very happy and would be even happier in the future. Humans would always have hope for the future. Qinshi always believed in an old saying, knowledge can change fate. But what he didn't expect was that before he could wait for the day when knowledge could change fate, a rainstorm had already changed his fate in advance. If it wasn't for the sudden thunderstorm, what would he be like now? Qinshi didn't know. And no one could know. His fate was inexplicably changed just like that. Although the process was difficult, the ending seemed to be much better than before. After all, in the past he only knew how to code, but now he could fly and burrow into the ground. Therefore, Qinshi was really a little curious. Why did this great gift bag of changing fate fall on his head? Although he didn't know if there was a spirit energy tide on that rainstorm 5 years ago. But based on the scale of today's tide, the spirit energy contained in it was actually far from enough to instantly teleport a person from Earth to the heavenly jade world. Therefore, he could conclude that either the scale of the spirit energy tide 5 years ago was far greater than today, or there were still some unknown large-scale formations or magic treasures hidden in the super first-tier city of Zhonghai. And those formations and magic treasures were all intact legendary existences. In short, no matter what the reason was, the truth behind it was far from what he could pry into with his current strength. It hadn't been long since Qinshi returned to Earth. But in this short period of half a year, he had already encountered a series of unimaginable things. And the question that puzzled him the most was, why was it that until today, except for an unknown divine general, he hadn't encountered anyone above the celestial being level? This didn't seem to make sense. Thinking of this, Chunshi couldn't help but make a bold guess in his heart. Perhaps Earth was originally a cultivation planet similar to the heavenly jade world? Until one day, due to some unknown reason, the Earth spirit chi dried up, so the Earth was completely reduced to a Vipralopa planet? For immortal cultivators, the planet of the last days was like an uninhabitable desert. Therefore, at this time leaving Earth was obviously their only choice. The immortal cultivators on Earth had left, and the inheritances they left behind could not be cultivated at all because of the sparse spiritual energy. Therefore, they were gradually reconstructed and simplified, turning into a series of inheritances like necromancers, warriors on Myoji, and so on. Chunshi stroked his chin, faintly feeling that his guess might be somewhat close to the truth. It was probably because of the existence of high-level immortal cultivators on Earth that the Siakin Glacier had such a mysterious palace that could affect the flow of time. Chunshi had already tasted the benefits of the Great Hall. Now that he suddenly realized that there might also be something of the same level as the Great Hall in Zhonghai, Chunshi couldn't help but feel a little moved. The reason why he hadn't taken the initiative to search for them before was mainly because his soul had yet to recover from its injuries at that time. Without his divine sense, he couldn't just wander around this huge city by relying on his eyes alone. Could he? Today, coincidentally, the spirit chi tide had appeared again. Perhaps he could take this opportunity to find the thing that had sent him to heavenly spiral from the surging spirit chi of heaven and earth. Chunshi seriously pondered for a while in the sky. Then, as if he had made a decision, he directly flew towards the seaside. The reason why he wanted to go to the seaside was because the spirit chi on the seaside was much denser than in the city. It was obviously somewhat abnormal. Chunshi quickly arrived at the seaside. However, before he had time to see the situation on the sea clearly, the sound of waves rumbled into his ears one after another. At this moment, the sky was already dark. Coupled with the dark clouds and torrential rain, there was not a single bit of light on the sea. Seeing this, Chunshi immediately lit up a ball of light and threw it out. Only then did he finally see the situation on the sea clearly. He saw that the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, were raised high like a wall of water. Then, they heavily slammed onto the shore. The waves came one after another, and the sound of waves crashing onto the shore came one after another. That majestic scene could be described as rapid waves rise to the sky, raging waves roll to the ground. The majestic sound was like thunder, and the surging waves were like rolling snow. Fortunately, the torrential rain had driven away the tourists by the seaside. Otherwise, with the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, coming wave after wave, who knew how many people would die on the spot? Looking at the situation, it seemed like there was a tsunami. However, from a scientific point of view, it was basically impossible for a tsunami to occur in Zhonghai. If there was a tsunami in Zhonghai, then the island country and the Gulf Coast in front of it would have become an underwater world by now. However, there was even an earthquake in Zhonghai today. What was so strange about a tsunami? Chunshi didn't stay at the seaside for too long. After briefly checking the situation along the coast, he directly flew towards the depths of the sea. The spirit chi of heaven and earth was getting denser and denser. Could it be, this time, the heaven and earth phenomenon really appeared on the sea? Chunshi frowned and looked at the sea surface as he continued to fly forward. After flying for about another 2 minutes, he finally arrived at the place where the spirit energy was the most concentrated. This location was no longer in Huaxia, but in the international waters of the Pacific Ocean. If he continued to fly forward, it wouldn't take long for him to reach Japan's territory. It was worth noting that even though Chunshi had flown so far, he still hadn't flown out of the range of the thunderstorm. From this, it could be seen how huge the scale of this thunderstorm was. Chunshi lit up another light ball. After looking around the surrounding environment, he descended to a height of about 10 meters above the sea surface. The sea surface below was very calm, and the slightly rippling sea surface seemed to be silently telling him, "There's nothing here." However, Qinshi wasn't stupid. The coastal area had surging waves and raging waves crashing onto the shore. But here, the sea was calm and the waves were vast. Wasn't this strange enough? After seeing the heaven and earth phenomenon in the Saikin Glacier, he was already mentally prepared. Although he didn't know why there was no spirit fog here, in terms of the concentration of spirit energy, this place was not inferior to the Saikin Glacier at all. Therefore, Qinshi could conclude that the heaven and earth phenomenon would definitely appear here. After confirming that there was nothing strange at the bottom of the sea, Qinshi simply sat cross-legged on the sea surface, cultivating while silently waiting for the heaven and earth phenomenon to appear. After about an hour, he suddenly opened his eyes. There was finally movement on the sea surface. Qinshi placed the light ball not far above the sea surface. Through the light emitted by the light ball, he could clearly see that a whirlpool suddenly appeared on the sea surface. The whirlpool was very small at first, and it looked like the whirlpool caused by a swimming pool when water was released. Its diameter was only about 50 centimeters. However, as time passed, the whirlpool began to expand rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. About 5 minutes later. Chapter 281. On the vast ocean, a huge whirlpool suddenly appeared. Under the illumination of the light ball, one could clearly see that the center of the whirlpool was rippling with white waves. The waves were surging, roaring, and howling. From afar, the whirlpool looked like a giant funnel. The slanted inner wall formed a 45-degree angle with the horizon. The waves, which had always been a symbol of beauty, now looked like sharp blades in a meat grinder, giving off a gloomy and terrifying feeling. In addition, there was a dark hole in the center of the whirlpool. When the light from the light ball shone into the hole, it was like shining into a bottomless abyss. The darkness swallowed everything, so much so that Qinshi could only see the entrance of the hole. He couldn't see anything else. What kind of whirlpool was this? It was like a ferocious beast, opening its huge mouth full of sharp teeth and fiercely letting out a deafening roar towards the sky. From a scientific point of view, the larger the whirlpool, the greater its destructive power. In order to form such a huge whirlpool, it must contain an enormous amount of energy. Qinshi was a top graduate from a top university in China, and he studied differential geometry in university. Unfortunately, at that time, he didn't have the photographic memory that he had now, so he had already returned the Stokes theorem and Maxwell-Faraday equations to his teacher. Now, he obviously couldn't calculate the strength of the whirlpool in front of him. However, even though he couldn't calculate the specific data, he could still make a bold guess. Based on the size of this whirlpool, which was thousands of meters in diameter, even if the United States Nimitz aircraft carrier came here, it would probably be instantly sucked into the whirlpool, then be turned into a pile of scrap metal by the sharp waves. After all, the Nimitz was only 300 meters long. In the face of such a huge whirlpool, what was the difference between an aircraft carrier and an ordinary fishing boat? It was just a question of who would sink first and who would sink later. The whirlpool in front of him was so dangerous, but Qinshi didn't seem to care at all. Therefore, after a brief observation, he actually plunged into the pitch-black cave. One had to know that the center of the vortex had a high flow rate and low pressure, while the edge had a high flow rate and high pressure. There would be a huge pressure difference between the two. Under the effect of the pressure, the vortex could swallow everything that could be swallowed. This principle was quite similar to that of a black hole. Therefore, after Qinshi flew into the center of the whirlpool, he immediately felt a huge pulling force coming from all directions. Although this power was strong enough to tear apart steel, to Qinshi it was still too childish. Thus, after using his true essence to prop up a barrier, Qinshi sat in the center of the whirlpool and began to cultivate. The whirlpool spun rapidly like a black hole, constantly devouring the surrounding spiritual energy. Because of the appearance of the spirit chi tide today, the density of the spirit chi of heaven and earth was naturally countless times higher than before. In addition, the whirlpool was constantly devouring and compressing the surrounding spirit chi of heaven and earth. After the two overlapped, it actually caused the spirit chi of heaven and earth in the center of the whirlpool to directly condense from a gaseous state into a liquid state. Chen-Chi originally thought that with his soul formation stage cultivation, he could absorb all the spirit chi of heaven and earth in less than 100 years. Now it seemed that this idea was indeed a bit too naive. It was simply a fool's dream. However, this was also good. At least he didn't have to hold back anymore, and could finally go all out. Therefore, Chen-Chi, who was sitting cross-legged in the center of the whirlpool, seemed to have turned into a glutton. The whirlpool was responsible for gathering the nearby spirit chi of heaven and earth for him, and he only needed to madly devour it. Because the spirit liquid was too pure, every drop contained a huge amount of spirit chi of heaven and earth. Therefore, in less than half an hour, Chen-Chi actually successfully condensed a drop of blood essence. This was undoubtedly a great thing for him, who only had one drop of blood essence left. Previously, he had the soul crystal to nourish his divine soul. Now he had the spirit liquid to condense his blood essence. At the same time, he also found a temple where the flow of time was different from the outside world. Since the recovery of the spirit chi, good things had been happening one after another. Thinking of this, Chen-Chi couldn't help but smile. At this rate, he estimated that it wouldn't be long before he could return to the peak and take a step towards the insightful emptiness realm. Chen-Chi was happy for a while. He planned to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to condense the third drop of blood essence in one go in preparation for his future cultivation. However, at this moment, an accident suddenly occurred. The pulling force of the whirlpool suddenly weakened, and the speed of the water in the center also began to rapidly slow down. This also caused the whirlpool to become smaller and smaller, just like when it first appeared. In less than a few minutes, the huge whirlpool actually shrank back to its original size. Chen-Chi frowned and flew out of the sea. The spirit chi had not dissipated, but why did the whirlpool disappear? Chen-Chi looked around in confusion. At this moment, a rumbling sound of thunder suddenly came from the sky. Boom! Thunder again. However, unlike before, the thunder appeared together with lightning. A bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the center of the whirlpool. Immediately after, a cyclone slowly rose from the sea. As the cyclone became thicker and thicker, it also rose higher and higher. After a while, a waterspout rose from the sea just like that. Like the legendary pillar that supported the sky, this waterspout that suddenly rose from the ground actually went straight to the sky and was tightly connected with the thunderclouds in the sky. Boom! Accompanied by the sound of thunder, another bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the waterspout that had just risen. The sky suddenly brightened, and countless snake-shaped lightning bolts shuttled back and forth in the waterspout. It looked particularly shocking. Chen-Chi finally understood. The whirlpool absorbed the spirit chi of heaven and earth. When the spirit chi accumulated to a certain extent, it would cause a waterspout. However, because he had swallowed most of the spirit chi, it took more than half an hour for the waterspout to condense and form. Well, it's better to wait and see what will happen today. Chen-Chi retreated a few hundred meters, temporarily distancing himself from the waterspout, ready to see what else would appear. However, at this moment, suddenly, a rumbling sound came from the sky. It was not thunder, but the sound of a plane. Chen-Chi looked up and saw a transport plane rushing out of the clouds in the distance. Then the transport plane flew straight towards the waterspout in the heavy rain. This kind of thunderstorm weather was not conducive to flying, and coupled with the strong airflow near the waterspout, the transport plane did not dare to approach at all. Therefore, the transport plane glided in the air for a while before opening the cargo door, dropping something and turning around to leave. Chen-Chi looked carefully and found that the small black dot dropped by the transport plane from a height of thousands of meters was not cargo at all, but a Chapter 282. A person. Just like an airdrop, he was directly dropped from the sky by a transport plane. With the help of a flash of lightning, Chen-Chi could clearly see that the person was only wearing a black combat suit. He didn't wear a parachute or a flight suit. After being dropped by the transport plane, the person spread out his hands and did a free fall in the sky. The height of the cumulonimbus cloud was generally between 600 and 2,000 meters. Tonight's thunderclouds gave people a strong sense of oppression, so it could be speculated that the height of the clouds tonight should be about 1,000 meters. 1,000 meters was actually not that high. It would take less than 15 seconds for an object to fall from a height of 1,000 meters. It was a short time, but the falling speed was very fast. When an object fell from a high altitude, due to the acceleration of gravity, the falling speed would become faster and faster. In contrast, the object would be subjected to greater and greater air resistance. When the air resistance reached a certain level, the air resistance would balance with gravity, causing the object to begin to move at a uniform speed. This speed was also called the ultimate speed or the finishing speed. Assuming that this person weighed 60 kilograms, then through the formula V equals, this person's ultimate speed would be 617 kilometers per hour. Falling into the sea at such a speed was no different from falling on a steel plate. With a smack sound, the person would probably be like a cake falling to the ground, instantly turning into a pool of paste. Of course, the above was only a hypothesis from a scientific point of view. Obviously, this outsider in front of him could not be judged by common sense. Sure enough, when the person fell into the sea, after the huge impact was offset by the seawater, he immediately got out of the sea as if nothing had happened. Then, he stepped on the stormy waves and went straight in the direction of Chunxi. He was indeed running. In ancient times, there was a dharma crossing the river with a reed, but this person did not even use a reed. He just stepped on the waves and ran directly. This directly showed that he had broken through the limits of the human body and stood at the peak of martial arts. And this was the so-called celestial. Chunxi floated in the air more than 10 meters above the sea and quietly watched the person running towards him. It was a man who looked about 30 years old. Although he was wearing a combat suit, he did not have any badge to prove his identity. This was not Huaxia's territory, but a public area in the world. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, any country had the right to interrogate and search stateless people and ships on the high seas. Therefore, this kind of behavior that did not even reveal his identity was actually very eye-catching. However, looking at his face, this man should be Huaxia's person. The man ran wildly on the waves and soon came not far below Chunxi. With the light ball around Chunxi, the man saw Chunxi's appearance. Immediately after that, he could not help but show a smile on his face and shouted excitedly, "Mr. Chun, I didn't expect it's you." His voice was so loud that even the sound of the stormy waves was drowned out. But what made him feel strange was that Chunxi did not immediately respond after hearing his words. Instead, he stretched out his hand and pointed to the sea in the distance. Seeing this, the man immediately turned his head and looked in the direction Chunxi pointed with some doubts. Perhaps because the sky was too dark and his vision was limited, the man looked for a while and did not find anything strange. Just when he was a little puzzled, a few strong lights suddenly appeared on the horizon in the distance. It was the light beam emitted by the military hernia searchlight. The rated power of 15 million watts also made the range of this searchlight reach up to 2,000 meters. It was also a necessary device for ships cruising at sea. As the searchlight's light became brighter and brighter, the man finally saw the appearance of the ship. It was a destroyer with the flag of the United States. Looking at the aggressive posture, it should be the American Army stationed in Okinawa. The rain poured down, and the thunder rumbled in the sky. The waterspout, like a pillar supporting the sky, seemed to have taken root and did not move from beginning to end. After the destroyer shone its searchlight on the waterspout from a distance, it immediately anchored 2 kilometers away. It seemed that it did not dare to get closer. However, although the destroyer did not dare to get closer, it still released a patrol boat. Afterward, the boat rushed straight in the direction of the waterspout with an unstoppable momentum. The sea today was not calm. There were whirlpools and waterspouts, and the waves were at least 3 or 4 meters high. But for some reason, even if the boat was about to be lifted up by the waves, it was able to fall back to the water safely in the end, and then continue to move forward. The waterspout rotated at high speed, like a giant dragon, constantly sucking the sea water from the sea to the sky. In the face of such a huge suction force, not to mention the boat, even the destroyer would be sent to the sky in an instant after approaching. It was unknown who the helmsman of this boat was, but the control of the boat and the judgment of the distance were extremely accurate. Therefore, under the delicate control of the helmsman, the moment the boat was about to enter the edge of the waterspout, it suddenly turned the bow, and then began to circle around the waterspout in a very extreme way. This was already the last safe distance. If the boat was a little closer to the waterspout, it was possible that it would be directly sucked into the turbulence of the waterspout, and then sent to the sky. The boat maintained the last safe distance, and then began to circle around the waterspout. Perhaps it was because the light ball around Chun-Shi was too eye-catching. The people on the boat immediately noticed him. Then, a deep voice came from the small boat. "Ha ha ha ha. I didn't expect Mr. Chun to be here. What a coincidence. Inyang Liao's deputy Inyang assistant, Ijiro Saito, greets you, sir." It was the original recipe, and the familiar smell. Ever since the last time he drove away Shintaro Abe, Chun-Shi had not encountered anyone from Inyang Liao. He did not expect to see them again today in the vast Pacific Ocean. And listening to his self-introduction, this Ijiro Saito, who had not yet appeared in front of him, seemed to be a level higher than Shintaro Abe. Chun-Shi floated in the air, quietly watching the various forces come one after another. After looking down at the small boat that was quickly approaching him, he looked up at the destroyer in the distance with the U.S. military flag flying over it. Even the United States was here. Looking at the star-spangled flag hanging high on the mast of the destroyer, Chun-Shi suddenly had a seemingly irrelevant question in his mind. Since Huaxia had martial artists, Inyang masters in Japan, Brahmins in India, and even tame headmasters in Southeast Asia. Chapter 283. After hearing Ijiro's greeting, Chun-Shi didn't respond to him. After all, as a Huaxia man, he would always feel some hostility towards a strange Japanese. In contrast, the Huaxia man in front of him was obviously easier to get Chun-Shi's approval. Therefore, after looking around, Chun-Shi focused his attention on the Huaxia man in front of him. Then he sat cross-legged in the air, lowered his head and said to him, "Look, they even brought a warship here, but you're all alone. Don't you think it's a bit too shabby?" Hearing this, the man shook his head and smiled bitterly. His name was Qin Shui, one of the main people in charge of the Wulian branch in Zhonghai, in charge of intelligence. Qin Shui had just stepped into the diviner stage, so his realm was not very stable, so his rating in the Wulian was only S-. The reason why he came here alone was because this was not a mission issued by the Wulian, but his own personal action. Tonight, there were all kinds of almost impossible natural disasters in Zhonghai, so the Wulian branch of Zhonghai naturally had to be dispatched to prevent any uncontrollable accidents. Qin Shui originally had a mission, but as the only diviner in the Zhonghai branch, he was keenly aware of a huge amount of energy at sea, so he mobilized a transport plane to send him here to check the situation. But what Qin Shui didn't expect was that when he arrived at the destination, he saw a person here. When Chun-Shi's family traveled, they never deliberately hid their identity, so Qin Shui always knew that Chun-Shi was in Zhonghai. Therefore, when he first saw the figure, Qin Shui subconsciously thought that this person should be Chun-Shi, so he changed his original plan and directly jumped out of the plane. The result was as he expected. The person in front of him was indeed Chun-Shi. Everyone in the Wulian branch knew about the new Yex-level existence. Qin Shui made a simple self-introduction, after which Chun-Shi nodded slightly and then asked, "Can you fly?" Chun-Shi was about 10 meters above the sea, about 3 or 4 stories high, so Qin Shui could only slightly raise his head when talking to him. After hearing Chun-Shi's words, Qin Shui was stunned for a moment, then he replied with a troubled expression, "Yes, but not for too long." As far as Qin Shui knew, if it wasn't necessary he would never fly. After all, for a martial artist, this kind of meaningless consumption was actually the same as an athlete who had to play a game the next day. "Oh, okay." After hearing Qin Shui's words, Chun-Shi gently waved his hand. Immediately after, a gentle force surrounded Qin Shui. Qin Shui's body suddenly, because he knew that Chun-Shi wouldn't attack him for no reason, he didn't resist too fiercely. So he just stared blankly as Chun-Shi lifted him into the air. This action, of course, this action. Assessed. This. It's really not as good as seeing it in person. As the waterspout continued to rotate, the density of the world's spiritual energy also began to rise, and soon it reached the level of the vortex just now. The tide of spiritual energy is extremely rare. Even Chen Shi wanted to take this opportunity to heal the injuries in his body, let alone Qin Shui. Therefore, under Chen Shi's guidance, Qin Shui sat cross-legged in the air and began to silently cultivate. Although Qin Shui didn't have a complete set of immortal cultivation methods, after all, he had reached the level of a celestial, so he had faintly grasped some of the principles of heaven and earth, and instinctively wanted to absorb the world's spiritual energy into his body. On the other side, Saito Ijiro sent a polite greeting to Chen Shi, but Chen Shi didn't respond, which made him quite dissatisfied, so he ignored Chen Shi and sat on the small boat to cultivate. At the same time, not far away on a destroyer, several heavily armed soldiers were standing in the cockpit, silently observing everything in front of them. These soldiers were all blonde United States people, and most of them were more than 1.9 meters tall. Compared to the ordinary staff in the cockpit, they looked like giants. One of the soldiers was holding a tablet in his hand, and he was constantly pointing on it. Reporting, Captain, the energy index is still rising, and it will reach the expected peak in about 10 minutes. Very good, continue to observe. Did you find the information of the two Huaxia people? Yes, one is called Qin Shui S- and the other is called Chen Shi Yex. Yex? Hearing this, the leading soldier couldn't help but frown slightly. Yes, we don't have relevant information in our database. This is the strength evaluation given by Yinyang Liao. What's the basis of the evaluation? There's only one battle video so far. Let me see. After that, the captain-like man took the tablet from his companion and clicked on the video. The video was taken by a surveillance satellite, and the location was in the Golden Triangle Meimen. The video was divided into several segments, one of which was the scene where Chen Shi crushed the missile with one hand. The video was very short, only 10 seconds long. After watching it, the man called the captain couldn't help but sneer. This is the so-called mysterious power of the East? Eric, what do you think? Not translation. Not bad, not bad. Note: in the future, foreigners will use the only official language of the universe, Chinese. After that, the man called Eric shrugged his shoulders with a look of disdain. To be honest, even trash like Ijiro Saito can get an S rating from Yinyang Liao, so I don't think this strength evaluation is credible. When he said this, his companion couldn't help but laugh. As the only superpower in the world, the people of the United States were naturally born with pride. The Japanese were a very strange people. They didn't seem to hate the United States who dropped the atomic bomb. Instead, they felt that the United States was the savior of Japan. Many fanatics even praised the United States with gratitude. Therefore, Ijiro Saito was very humble in front of the people of the United States. But what Ijiro Saito didn't expect was that his humility lowered his evaluation in the hearts of the people of the United States, and even affected the credibility of Yinyang Liao's strength evaluation. As time went by, the water spout did not become smaller, but thicker and thicker. About half an hour later, the energy contained in the water spout seemed to have reached its limit. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck the water spout. The water spout immediately became like an electrified light tube, and light blue snake-shaped electric arcs flashed wildly in it. A huge amount of energy filled it, and the waterspout suddenly expanded more than 10 meters outward at a speed visible to the naked eye. It looked like it was about to explode. Qin Shui opened his eyes and looked at the scene in front of him. Before he could recover, he was pulled back by Chen Shi and instantly retreated hundreds of meters away. At this time, the waterspout also began to shake violently. Qin Shui had never seen such a scene, so he couldn't help but ask, what's going on? However, before Chen Shi could answer his question, the waterspout in front of him suddenly changed again. The originally thick waterspout suddenly separated from the sky and became two in an instant. The two waterspouts rotated and intersected, spiraling straight into the sky, and their shape looked somewhat similar to a fried dough twist. Chen Shi frowned slightly, because he suddenly found that all the surrounding spiritual energy was madly rushing towards the center of the two waterspouts. And with the continuous influx of spiritual energy, A bright light suddenly appeared in a position in the middle of the two waterspouts. The light was white, and at first it was only the size of a star. But after a few breaths, the light suddenly burst into an extremely dazzling light. Like the rising sun, it instantly dispelled all the haze between heaven and earth. Such a dazzling light suddenly made Qin Shui couldn't help but close his eyes and slightly tilt his head, not daring to look at it again. But Chen Shi didn't seem to be affected at all. She raised her head slightly and calmly looked at the source of the light. Finally. Chapter 284. The two waterspouts spiraled into the sky. Rumbling sounds of thunder rang out one after another. When the lightning struck the huge water tornadoes, countless light blue electric currents immediately surged wildly within the water tornadoes, so much so that the two water tornadoes faintly glowed with blue light. Then, the electric currents in the water column suddenly converged at the center of the waterspouts, emitting a faint white light that looked like stars at night. With the continuous influx of spirit energy, the white light suddenly became like the sun, bursting with an extremely dazzling light. The white light dispelled the dark haze between heaven and earth, and even the thunderstorm that had not stopped just now strangely stopped. This was really a very strange scene. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and the sun had already drilled from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. But under the white light, it seemed to bring people to a sunny afternoon. The wind was gentle, the sun was bright, and the sea was blue. The salty sea breeze kept slapping on their faces. If there were no two violent waterspouts, the whole scene could be said to be perfect. The two waterspouts continued to revolve around the ball of light, just like two gigantic dragons that were having fun. Flood dragons going to the sea. Two dragons playing with a pearl. After Chen Shi pulled Qin Shui back a few hundred meters, he looked up at the strong light. But after a mere 10 seconds he suddenly realized that a black shadow suddenly appeared in the strong light. This familiar scene immediately made Chen Shi frown deeply. But in an instant, many thoughts flashed through his mind. Spirit energy exhaustion, strange phenomenon of heaven and earth spirit energy recovery. Heaven opening. His cheap father-in-law once said that the heavenly gate had not appeared for more than 100 years. In the understanding of great-granduncle and the others, the heavenly gate was the southern gate of the heavenly court. Just like in myths and legends, when the heavenly gate opened, mortals could ascend and become immortals. Chen Shi originally thought that with the spirit energy situation on Earth, it was absolutely impossible to breed high-level immortal cultivators, so he had never taken the heavenly gate issue to heart. In Chen Shi's understanding, the Elysium was just a legend on Earth. But combined with the recent series of events, he had finally figured it out. Even though there were no immortal cultivators on Earth now, it didn't mean that there weren't any in the past. They just left. He went to a place called the Heavenly Gate by later generations. Weren't those old fogies in the village dreaming of the day when the gate of heaven would open again and take them to the celestial world? The Heavenly Gate should be a large-scale teleportation array. Xian Nu's spirit was the coordinates of the array that connected the two realms. As for the so-called immortal realm, it was probably a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. Because the spiritual energy on Earth was too sparse, the only way to maintain the connection between the two realms was to sacrifice Xian Nu's soul. As for that immortal general who had been killed, Chen Shi thought that he was a helper that those old B** stars had found from somewhere. Come to think of it, divine generals, weren't they the immortal cultivators who left Earth? Otherwise, with the current cultivation conditions on Earth, the celestial being was already the limit. How could a divine general comparable to Yuan Ying be born? In the blink of an eye, Chen Shi sorted out the conjectures in his mind. Because he left Earth, when he returned, he never thought that his home planet was actually a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. At this moment, Chen Shi's heart was filled with mixed feelings, and an indescribable feeling suddenly gushed out. One had to know that his current state of mind was completely different from when he first returned. Because he had Nian Yan, and at the same time, he had found Ying Ying. They were a happy family. Chen Shi had always been someone who cared about his wife and children. As long as the people he cared about were by his side, everything else did not matter. With the cultivation conditions on Earth, He might not be able to take another step toward the soul formation stage in this lifetime. However, Chunxi did not feel regret. Instead, he was optimistic that as long as Yingying could cultivate to Yuanying, he would be very satisfied. Chunxi even thought that if Yingying really could not cultivate to Yuanying, he could reluctantly accept the golden core stage. After all, 500 years was not a long time. A family could live happily together for 500 years. What kind of concept was that? Furthermore, even if he really could not accept the terrible ending of Yingying leaving first and dying alone, he could at least try to bring Yingying and Nianyan back to the heavenly jade domain and find a way to prolong their lives, right? The future was still early, and it was more important to live well in the present. Therefore, before Nianyan became an adult, Chunxi would not consider what the future would be like. However, what Chunxi did not expect was that reality was completely different from what he had imagined. Originally, he just wanted to retire and take care of his children on Earth, but he did not expect Earth to be a cultivation holy land comparable to the heavenly jade domain. At least, it used to be. This made Chunxi feel that it was very unreal. Could it be, his peaceful and happy life was going to be broken? And the reason why Chunxi had such a feeling was that he knew how cruel the world of immortal cultivators was. Immortal cultivators were supposed to compete with the heavens and with people. Although there would always be people who naively thought that immortal cultivators could actually join hands and advance together, side by side. However, they neglected the most important problem, and that was cultivation resources were limited. Although spirit chi could be continuously regenerated, and heavenly treasures could be regenerated indefinitely, the problem was, the lifespan of immortal cultivators was also limited. How to obtain more cultivation resources within their limited lifespan, to continuously improve their realm was the problem that every immortal cultivator had to face. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. If one could not obtain more resources to improve themselves, then they were destined to be eliminated. What was the result of being eliminated? There was only one result, and that was death. This was the real world of immortal cultivators. Compared to the other divine lords in the heavenly jade domain, Chunxi's temperament was indeed much gentler, but he was not a person who liked to avoid problems. Since the problem had already appeared, then there was only one question left in his heart. Divine General. What level was he in the heavenly gate? The grudge had already been formed. If the other party did not pursue the matter, then Chunxi could also pretend that this matter did not happen. But if the other party wanted to pursue the matter, thinking of this, Chunxi could not help but ignite a burning desire to fight in his heart. In the past, he did not care about his life, and even if it was a narrow escape, he would still cross the void. But today was different from the past. As a man, every time he swung his sword, it was no longer for himself, but for his wife and children behind him. If he were to fall as well, what would happen to Yingying and Nianyan? Chunxi's mind was full of thoughts. At this time, the black figure finally walked out of the strong light. But what made Chunxi a little surprised was Chapter 285. Two dragons playing with a pearl. The heavens opened a gate. Chunxi originally wanted to pick up some scraps from this heavenly vision. If he could find another strange existence like the Temple of Time, it would be a very happy thing for him. But it was a pity. He didn't find anything good. Instead, he witnessed the entire process of the Gate of Heaven. With the opening of the Gate of Heaven, three figures also walked out of the strong light one after another. Walking in front was a man wearing a blue brocade robe and a belt around his waist. He was about 30 years old. After walking out of the strong light, the man in blue took a few steps in the air, then slightly turned his body to look at the strong light, as if waiting for his companions. Then, another man walked out of the strong light. That person was wearing a white straight crane cloak. Coupled with the otherworldly temperament on his body, it could be said that he was a stranger like jade, unparalleled in the world. The man in white's temperament was so outstanding, but the third figure following behind him was not inferior in the slightest. Moreover, it was a woman. The woman was very thin, with prominent cheekbones. She was wearing a water blue fairy dress and had a cinnabar between her eyebrows. She looked a bit like Mansion in The Promise. If one had to use a word to describe her, it could only be Khufu. This kind of face was indeed very unlikable, but if coupled with the cold and otherworldly temperament on her body, it brought a different kind of beauty. 2 men and 1 woman. They were all dressed very strangely. At least in the eyes of modern people in the 21st century, they were simply like ancient characters who walked out of an ink painting. The 3 seemed to be led by the woman who appeared last. After the woman appeared, she arrogantly scanned the surroundings. When she saw Chen Shi dragging Qin Shuai and flying in the air more than 10 meters above the sea, the corners of her mouth couldn't help but raise a slightly contemptuous smile. However, after briefly sizing up Chen Shi and Qin Shuai, the woman quickly withdrew her gaze, and then took out something similar to a magic weapon from her arms. That thing was spherical, about the size of a palm, and had a metallic texture. There were many strange symbols engraved on the spherical surface. After the woman took out the small ball, a faint fluorescent light emerged from her palm. Then, the small ball floated up strangely. At this moment, the woman said to the 2 companions beside her, "There's a problem. The spiritual qi is much less than I thought. Based on the current situation, we only have the time for an incense stick to burn at most." Hearing this, the man in green immediately asked doubtfully, "An incense stick's worth of time? Didn't you say that we have at least 2 hours? I don't know what's going on." The woman frowned. After thinking for a while, she explained, "Hun Xiang's judgment can't be wrong. I think it's because there are too many impurities in this world's spiritual energy, which caused the previous judgment to be wrong. Now is not the time to discuss this. Since time is so tight, let's act according to what we discussed before. Shui Xiang will guard this place. I'll go find Gui Yao. Qingwan, you go find Changli. What do you think?" "All right." After hearing the man in white's words, the woman and the man in green immediately nodded. If great-granduncle was still alive, perhaps he could determine the identities of the 3 people in front of him based on the contents recorded in the ancient books. Shui Xiang, Qingwan Baihong, and the divine general who had died under Chen Shi's sword combination, Changli. After a simple discussion, Qing Wan and Baihong instantly turned into streaks of light and flew in different directions. From the beginning to the end, the 2 of them didn't even look at Chen Shi. Perhaps to them, Chen Shi and Qin Shuai in front of them were just insects that could fly. Qing Wan and Baihong left. But the moment they left, the destroyer that had been parked in the distance suddenly raised its main cannon. Bang! Following the appearance of a burst of flames, the destroyer actually opened fire. And the position the cannon was aiming at was the strong light in the middle of the 2 waterspouts. One had to know that the woman called Shui Xiang was currently floating in the air at the location of the strong light. This sudden cannon shot really shocked everyone present. Sitting on the boat, Ijiro Saito stared in the direction of the destroyer in a daze. When he saw the cannonball smashing toward the position of the strong light at 3 times the speed of sound, Ijiro Saito's face suddenly showed a shocked and angry expression. He couldn't help but yell in the direction of the destroyer, "Baka!" With the continuous development of modern technology, the status of naval cannons had long been replaced by missiles. Therefore, naval cannons were generally only used in close-range defensive battles or warning shots. This cannon shot was a warning issued by the U.S. Army. It was a warning to the 3 people who suddenly appeared from the strong light not to act rashly and obediently accept their interrogation. The firing rate of naval cannons was as high as 1,000 meters per second. Therefore, in less than 2 seconds, the cannonball had already hit the woman's position. The woman was stunned for a moment, as if she didn't expect the insects in front of her to dare to attack her. Because she was too angry, a hint of red flashed across the woman's face. Then she waved her sleeves fiercely, frowned, and widened her eyes. She shouted in the direction of the destroyer, "You're asking for it." As the woman waved her sleeves, she grabbed with her slender hand, and a huge burst of energy suddenly burst out. The cannonball that had already flown in front of her suddenly stopped in the air, as if it had hit a wall of air. Then the 2 waterspouts seemed to have come alive. They fiercely poked their heads down from the sky and pointed at the destroyer in the shape of a bow. From afar, how were these waterspouts? They were simply 2 flood dragons that were ready to pounce. As the woman pointed from afar, Two waterspouts immediately shot forth, spiraling toward the destroyer viciously. Flood dragons emerge from the sea, swallowing thousands of miles of mountains and rivers. In the face of this monstrous wave, what was the difference between the destroyer and a wooden boat? Boom! With the rumbling sound of the waves, the overwhelming wave instantly slammed the destroyer to the bottom of the sea. When everything returned to silence, there was nothing left on the vast ocean. Chapter 286. There was an old saying in Huaxia. The police of the Pacific Ocean were very strict. The people of the United States had always been arrogant and self-proclaimed to be the world's overlords. They would go to other people's territory in the name of maintaining world peace. Naturally, many countries were angry but didn't dare to say anything. It just so happened that the heavenly vision appeared in the high seas not far from Okinawa, so the people of the United States naturally came to join in the fun. But what these people of the United States would never have thought was that they kicked a steel plate this time. The woman was called Shui Xiang by her companions, and with her skill just now, Qinshi also guessed that her cultivation method should be inclined to the water attribute. Therefore, the endless Pacific Ocean in front of him was obviously her home ground, provoking others in their home ground, and the other party was a celestial being. What was the difference between such behavior and the kamikaze squad of Japan? Qinshi silently played the role of a spectator. In fact, since these three people appeared, he had been seriously thinking about a problem. That was, should he make the first move to gain the upper hand? Perhaps because they were bold, the three of them didn't set up any soundproof restrictions when they were discussing things just now. Therefore, the conversation between the three of them was also passed to Qinshi's ears. Dayo? Chengli? Although he didn't know what these two terms meant, it could be speculated that one of them should refer to the divine general who had died under his sword. The three of them obviously didn't know that the divine general was dead, so they only mentioned looking for him, not revenge. In that case, then should he take advantage of the opportunity when they were acting separately and kill the three of them one by one? Or should he keep his composure and pretend that nothing had happened? Qinshi thought about this problem very seriously. Just when he was hesitating, the woman suddenly turned her head and looked at him and Qin Shui. At this moment, within a radius of 10 miles, except for Saito Ijiro on the boat, only Qin Shui and Qinshi were left. Qin Shui was just a warrior who had just stepped into the celestial realm, so the woman didn't take him seriously at all. As for Qinshi on the side, because she couldn't detect any fluctuation of spirit energy from Qinshi, she only thought of Qinshi as Qin Shui's follower. The woman's temper was not very good to begin with, and after being provoked by a group of ants, she was even more furious. Thus, when she saw the small boat below, she couldn't help but wave her sleeves again. Immediately after, a huge wave rose from the sea below and smashed directly in the direction of the small boat. Seeing this, Ijiro Saito didn't even care about the boat. He jumped into the sea, and then ran wildly on the water. The wind is tight, retreat. The woman had only casually raised a huge wave, and it was enough to frighten this Inyang Liao executive, who scrambled away like a dog. Fortunately, the woman didn't seem to want to argue with these ants in front of her, so when she saw Ijiro running away, she turned her eyes back to Qinshi and Qin Shui. This was the third time she had set her eyes on the two of them. Therefore, the moment she looked at Qin Shui, he felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, and all the hair on his body stood on end. Seeing this, Qin Shui could only tilt his head slightly and whisper to Qinshi, "Mr. Chen, how about, let's go?" Although Qin Shui didn't know what level of strength the woman in front of him had reached, he knew very well. This woman was definitely not someone he could mess with, so he subconsciously wanted to leave here. Qin Shui proposed his idea, but Qinshi didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he turned his head and looked in the direction of the destroyer with interest. At the same time, the woman in the air seemed to have noticed something, so she quickly turned her head and saw two missiles suddenly shot out of the sea. The missiles broke through the surface of the sea, and after flying to a certain height, they suddenly turned the warhead and blasted directly in the direction of the woman. At the same time as the missiles were fired, several figures suddenly emerged from the bottom of the sea. It was the group of United States soldiers. But what was strange was that these soldiers were all wearing a set of metal armor-like equipment at the moment, so from a distance, they looked like a group of robot soldiers. This should be the exoskeleton armor secretly developed by the United States. I didn't expect this technology to be mature enough to be used in actual combat. Qin Shuai's reaction was also extremely fast. After seeing the appearance of this group of robot soldiers, he quickly explained to Chen Shi, mechanical exoskeleton armor. This was a project that the United States had been deeply researching and developing in recent years. The purpose was to allow ordinary soldiers to have extraordinary combat capabilities. Chen Shi's eyesight was much better than Qin Shuai's, so he saw it very clearly. The shape of these exoskeleton armors was somewhat similar to the mass-produced version of Iron Man 2. The United States had only been founded for more than 200 years, so naturally, they didn't have as deep a cultural heritage as Huaxia. Although they didn't have martial artists or necromancers, they could make ordinary soldiers have the strength to fight with martial artists through research and technology. And once the research and development was successful, it meant mass production. Because of the root aptitude and other reasons, ordinary people may not be able to reach transforming strength in their lifetime. But as long as they wore the exoskeleton armor, even ordinary people could instantly have the powerful strength of a transforming strength warrior. It was conceivable that an army composed entirely of transforming strength warriors would be so formidable. This was the fundamental reason why the United States were so domineering. Because Xue Xiang directly smashed the destroyer, it was obvious that she and the United States were in a situation where one of them had to die. Looking at the dense rocket barrage constantly bombarding Xue Xiang, Qin Shuai was so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth. Even Chen Shi couldn't help but think of a joke at this moment that made him feel a little bit awkward. Iron Man versus the ancient cultivators? Boom, boom, boom. After 2 missiles, countless shoulder-fired rockets bombarded the woman in midair one after another. Like fireworks during the New Year, the rockets continued to explode one after another. In an instant, the thick smoke produced by the explosion filled the entire sky. The United States were rich, so they were never stingy with ammunition. Therefore, after a full round of bombardment, the leading soldier finally raised his right hand, clenched his fist, and made a gesture to stop the attack. But the moment they stopped the bombardment, a scream full of anger suddenly resounded throughout the sky. Chapter 287. With Xue Xiang's angry rebuke, a strong wind blew on the surface of the sea. The sea wind howled and the waves roared. Since the sun set, the vast Pacific Ocean seemed to have never been calm. In just a few breaths, the strong wind swept away the billowing smoke caused by the explosion. Then, Xue Xiang's figure slowly emerged from the thick smoke. Although she was bombarded by the United States, there was no sign of injury on her body, as if she was not here at all. In fact, Xue Xiang's appearance was beautiful, but she always faintly gave people a feeling of acrimony and being unapproachable. In the words of the aunt in the park who arranged a blind date for her son, it was this girl's face was not good. She would jinx her husband. Marrying her home would shorten his lifespan. As for whether Xue Xiang jinxed her husband or not, obviously, no one knew the answer to this question. However, Chen Shi and Qin Shuai, who were onlookers, knew very well that the group of United States people in front of them were all going to become short-lived ghosts. Xue Xiang floated in the air expressionlessly. Her face, which looked a little rosy just now, became a little pale at the moment. She looked like a sick patient in the hospital. Of course she was not sick. If Qing Wan and Bai Hong were still here, they would immediately dodge to the side and carefully keep a safe distance from her. After all, a woman was very scary when she went crazy. Because of the existence of the protective shield, this level of bombardment was actually no different from scratching an itch for Xue Xiang. And the reason why she was so angry was entirely because she didn't expect that these damn ants would dare to provoke her again and again. She felt as if a mangy dog was barking around her, and from time to time, it would pounce on her and bite her. Even if it couldn't bite her, it still successfully disgusted her. Therefore, when Xue Xiang waved her sleeves again with a cold face, the surrounding temperature seemed to have dropped a lot. Then, the sea surface where the United States soldiers were located surged violently. Immediately afterward, a huge force suddenly surged out from the bottom of the sea. Before the soldiers could react, they were directly sprayed into the sky by this force. Thrusters. Spread out, spread out. Attack at will. With the help of the thrusters, the soldiers were like hornets flying up and down in the air. At the same time, they were crazily firing at Shui Xiang's location. Boom. In an instant, bullets gushed out like raindrops. At the same time, countless rocket launchers were launched one after another at Shui Xiang. A new round of suppressive fire began. However, just as they were about to launch their attacks, the sea beneath them suddenly began to boil. Countless tiny water arrows shot out from the sea at an extremely fast speed, looking somewhat like a fountain. A dense rain of water arrows shot from the sea into the sky. Because a soldier couldn't dodge in time, he was pierced by those tiny water arrows on the spot. Accompanied by a heart-wrenching scream, the unlucky soldier fell from the sky like a wild goose that had been shot by an arrow. Pull up! Pull up! The thrusters were fully activated, and the remaining soldiers instantly flew hundreds of meters into the air. But it was a pity. Although their flying speed was fast, the water arrows shot from the sea were much faster than them. Therefore, in just a few seconds, more than half of this elite team, whose combat power could be said to be the world's top elite team, had been killed or injured. Calling headquarters requesting. Seeing that the situation was not right, the leading soldier immediately wanted to ask for support from headquarters. But before he could even finish speaking, a water arrow comparable to a laser directly pierced through the exoskeleton armor on his body. Blood rained down, and the entire world was quiet. Shui Xiang turned her head again, and looked at the two people not far away. This was already the fourth time she looked at Chen Shi and Qin Shuai. Therefore, Qin Shuai suddenly felt like he was being stared at by a prehistoric beast. This also made him finally realize that death was so close to him. Under Shui Xiang's expressionless gaze, Qin Shuai didn't even dare to breathe. Every second felt like a year. But luckily for him, after Shui Xiang stared at them for a full 3 seconds, she didn't attack the two of them. Instead, she spat out a word coldly. Get out! Hearing this, Qin Shuai suddenly felt like he had been pardoned. In a moment of excitement, he grabbed Chen Shi's arm a little rudely, and then quickly whispered, Mr. Chen, let's go. If we don't go now, I'm afraid we won't be able to leave. To be honest, if it weren't for Chen Shi's reluctance to leave, he would have already run away like Ijiro Saito. It was fine to watch the show, but he couldn't throw his life away, right? Perhaps sensing the fear in Qin Shuai's heart, Chen Shi didn't mean to blame him. Instead, he reached out and patted the back of his hand. You go first, I still have something to talk to her alone. Before Qin Shuai could react, an invisible force pushed him out. Mr. Chen. You. Qin Shuai struggled, wanting to say something, but his mouth was blocked by Chen Shi's true essence. This scene also made Shui Xiang, who had been expressionless, instantly change her expression. This man, who didn't have the slightest fluctuation of spirit energy on his body, was actually a celestial being? Did she make an error in judgment? Shui Xiang was a little bewildered. But at this time, Chen Shi was like a tourist climbing a mountain. Step by step, he walked in the air and slowly rose to Shui Xiang's height. Who are you? Until now, Shui Xiang hadn't noticed any signs of spirit energy fluctuations on Chen Shi's body. How was this possible? Shui Xiang frowned slightly, and the expression on her face couldn't help but become much more dignified. Chen Shi heard Shui Xiang's question, but he didn't mean to answer. Instead, he asked, Do you know there is a weapon in this world called a nuclear bomb? What is it? It seems that you don't know. Looking at Shui Xiang's puzzled face, Chen Shi didn't mean to explain. Instead, he continued, Actually, I'm very curious. Can you withstand a nuclear bomb attack? Hearing this, a trace of displeasure flashed across Shui Xiang's face. Although she didn't know what a nuclear bomb was, since the man in front of her mentioned the word weapon and attack, it naturally aroused her vigilance. Pretending to be mysterious, then I'll test how strong you are. Following a cold snort, Shui Xiang's slender hand moved, and a water arrow suddenly shot out from the sea. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't move at all. Instead, he said calmly, under normal circumstances, I don't fight with women. But in order to avoid unnecessary trouble in the future, I can only tell you today, I'm sorry. As his voice fell, a long sword suddenly appeared in Chen-Shi's hand. Dharma. Chapter 288. Shui Xiang couldn't help but frown the moment she saw the appearance of the godly sword Dharma form. You actually used the Dharma form as a weapon? There was some doubt in her tone, but at the same time, there was some amazement. Without a doubt, Shui Xiang understood the usage of the Dharma form very well. But it was precisely because of this that she felt rather surprised. Dharma form? It could actually be used like this? Shui Xiang had never seen anyone use the Dharma form as a weapon since she started cultivating. Could it be that this mysterious man in front of her didn't even have a suitable Dharma treasure weapon? Or was it because this man didn't even put her in his eyes, so he didn't even want to use a Dharma treasure? The moment this conjecture appeared in Shui Xiang's mind, she couldn't suppress the raging anger in her heart. He was just an ant from the lower realm, and he actually dared to look down on her like this? He was simply arrogant to the extreme. I originally didn't want to kill more people, but you insisted on committing suicide. Since that's the case, then I'll do as you wish and personally send you on your way. As her voice fell, Shui Xiang stretched out her right hand and pointed fiercely at Chen-Shi. Then, the aqua-blue cloak that had been wrapped around her hand suddenly seemed to come alive. After it circled around her arm, it was like a little blue snake that shot straight towards Chen-Shi. The so-called cloak referred to the silk and satin gauze that ancient women wrapped around their arms. It could also be called a long damask and was purely a decorative item. The woman held the cloak in her hand. When she stood, the cloak naturally hung down like a calm pool of water. When she walked, it fluttered and stretched like a willow tree in the wind. How beautiful was the combination of movement and stillness. Shui Xiang danced with the long damask, like a fairy flying out of a Dunhuang mural. Seeing this, Chen-Shi didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating her. Instead, he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and ferociously channeled all the vital energy in his body into the long sword. So much so that the long sword in his hand suddenly glowed with a strong light. And the reason why Chen-Shi was so cautious was because this cloak was Shui Xiang's natal Dharma treasure, azure billowing silk gauze. After the long damask flew out from Shui Xiang's hand, it suddenly became bigger, and instantly became like a curtain that covered the entire sky. Seeing that the situation was not right, Chen-Shi immediately rose into the air, wanting to fly out of the area covered by the long silk. However, what Chen-Shi did not expect was that Changling's speed was quite fast. It was like a big net falling from the sky, covering Chen-Shi's head in an instant. Then it tightened bit by bit like wrapping a dumpling, wrapping Chen-Shi firmly. Chen-Shi brandished his long sword, trying to split the long silk. However, this long silk seemed to be made of water. After the sword pierced into it, it did not encounter any resistance. No matter how Chen-Shi slashed, the long silk did not show any signs of damage. Chen-Shi tried to touch the long silk with his hand, wanting to tear it apart. However, he found that the long silk had become extraordinarily sturdy. No matter how hard he tried, it was futile. It could be said to be both soft and hard. In the face of this unbreakable long silk, Chen-Shi had no way to break it. He could only watch as he was wrapped in the long silk like a mummy. Looking at how the azure billowing silk gauze tied up Chen-Shi so easily, Shui Xiang could not help but laugh contemptuously. You only have this little ability? She thought that this man might have some ability. She did not expect that he was just a guy who was strong in appearance but weak in reality. It may be more than that. Even though he was tied up like a dumpling, Chen-Shi's face still did not show any expression of panic. Instead, he calmly replied to her, "You don't know life from death." Shui Xiang glanced at him and then waved her arm. An icicle suddenly appeared not far from Chen-Shi's forehead. Looking at that posture, Shui Xiang probably wanted to use the icicle to cut open his head. However, at this critical juncture, Chen-Shi did not seem to be anxious at all. Instead, he suddenly smiled and said, "Let me give you a piece of advice. When you are fighting with others, don't let your guard down, especially behind you." Hearing this, Shui Xiang could not help but frown and quickly turned to look behind her. At this time, she found that the divine sword Dharma idol was not far behind her when she did not know when. The divine sword was slightly blooming with a strange light, but Shui Xiang could not detect any signs of spiritual energy fluctuations on this sword at all. Until, when the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly flew toward her, Shui Xiang finally realized that it contained a huge amount of spiritual energy. You. Shameless. A lion would use all its strength to hunt a rabbit. Even if the opponent was a woman. Even if the method used was despised, Chunxi still chose to take her down in a way that was close to a sneak attack. In fact, when Shui Xiang was fighting with the group of United States guys just now, Chunxi had quietly set up a large aura-concealing array and used it to show weakness to the enemy in order to catch them off guard. Shui Xiang was indeed tricked. Perhaps she did not even think that this man, in addition to being far more powerful than her, would actually use a sneak attack method. When the aura-concealing array could not hide the spiritual energy fluctuations contained in the divine sword Dharma idol, Shui Xiang finally realized how terrifying this man in front of her was. Setting the universe as the god, the Qianquan sword finger. Man and earth worship heaven for the heavenly sword. The three famous swords, heavenly sword. The first move was a killing move. Shui Xiang's reaction was also very fast. With a wave of her arm, the long silk immediately flew out from Chunxi's body. The spiritual energy fluctuations on the divine sword Dharma idol gave her a lot of pressure. Shui Xiang did not think that she could steadily take this sword with just the protective aura, so she quickly recalled the long silk. But it was a pity. Chunxi obviously would not give her this opportunity. Therefore, with a thought, the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly cut through the sky like a bolt of lightning and instantly came in front of Shui Xiang. The sword was 3 feet long. A green rainbow pierced the sky. Under Chunxi's killing move that had been accumulating power for a long time, Shui Xiang did not even have time to react. The divine sword Dharma idol directly broke through the protective aura and directly pierced through her slender body. At this time, the long silk that came late finally returned to Shui Xiang's hands. Shui Xiang lowered her head and stared blankly at her abdomen. This sword, it directly pierced through her body and at the same time, shattered her middle dantian. However, after all, she was in existence above the heavens. Although the injury was very serious, as long as it was treated in time, there was still a chance for recovery. But would Chunxi give her this chance? Shui Xiang instinctively wanted to escape. But when she felt the surging spiritual energy fluctuations behind her, Shui Xiang made a completely different choice from Changli's. As a result, Shui Xiang suddenly let out a shrill and high-pitched scream. Immediately after, the long silk on her arm suddenly danced, and then wrapped around her body again and again. At the same time, the spiritual energy in Shui Xiang's body also began to fluctuate violently. And as the spiritual energy in her body continued to flow out, the surrounding temperature also suddenly dropped. After the long silk had completely wrapped Shui Xiang, her body began to freeze. Just like in the movie The Day After Tomorrow. The extremely cold aura that flowed out from Shui Xiang's body almost instantly froze the sea. Then, a huge ice block appeared in front of Chunxi. This woman. Chapter 289. The spirit qi that overflowed from Shui Xiang's body seemed to have a strange magical power. Under the influence of the spirit qi, the blue and magnificent sea began to gradually freeze at a speed visible to the naked eye. Therefore, in a short while the sea that Chunxi could see had all turned into polar glaciers. Perhaps it was because the temperature had dropped too much. When the extremely cold aura spread out with Shui Xiang as the center, even the waves of the sea maintained their original shape, as if they had become Tianshan snow lotuses of all shapes and sizes. Facing such a strange scene, even Chunxi could not help but be amazed. Shui Xiang turned into a lump of ice and floated in the air. After the ocean below was frozen, the ice that sealed Shui Xiang also fell heavily from the sky. Bang! The huge ice hit the ice and immediately splashed a lot of ice chips. At the same time, countless spiderweb-like cracks appeared on the ice. Seeing this, Chunxi could not help but frown slightly. Immediately after, he He raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the ice in the air. A green sword light burst out and hit the ice block in an instant. But what surprised Chun-Shi was that this sword did not leave any trace on the ice. In fact, there wasn't even a single scratch on his skin. How could this be an ice cube? It was like the vibranium shield in the hands of Captain America. It was a super hard metal that only existed in science fiction movies. No wonder Shui Xiang did not choose to escape after being injured, but chose to freeze herself. Come to think of it, this was her last life-saving means. Chun-Shi came to the ice, reached out and knocked on the ice, then thoughtfully dispersed the divine sword Dharma in his hand. This ice contained most of the true qi that Shui Xiang had obtained over the years, so it became so hard. Although Chun-Shi could break the ice and forcibly dig Shui Xiang out of the ice, it would take a certain amount of time. Therefore, after thinking about it, he decisively threw this idea to the back of his mind. In fact, Chun-Shi was not the kind of devil who would kill everyone once he made a move. The reason why he attacked Shui Xiang was mainly because he wanted the three of them to stay on Earth temporarily, and use this to buy himself some time. Last time, in order to help Ying find the silver immortal soul, Chun-Shi directly killed the clan elder and Changli. However, he did not silence them, so the entire village knew of his existence. Fortunately, Wu Lian had already recruited most of the villagers, so as long as Wu Lian issued a gag order, there shouldn't be any more problems. In addition, based on the previously known clues, it was obvious that the divine gate was not something that could be opened at will. Once he cut off all the clues, even if the gate of heaven opened again, what could he do? Could it be that he really had to find this murderer in this vast sea of people? Was that even possible? Chun-Shi calculated carefully. It wasn't because he realized that there might be a holy land of immortal cultivation that was comparable to the heavenly spiral continent behind the heavenly gates that he was afraid of. It was because he didn't want to cause trouble. Just like what he usually said when he taught Nian. We don't cause trouble, but we're not afraid of trouble. Right now, he simply wanted to give his wife and children a stable and happy family. This was the only thing he wanted to pursue for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi took out the satellite phone that Wu Lian gave him during the last mission, and then called his sister-in-law. Qin Shui seemed to have reported what happened here to the headquarters. Therefore, when Qin Xueqing received Chun-Shi's call, she directly asked, "Do you need backup?" "No, it's more or less settled." Chun-Shi told his sister-in-law his thoughts as he slowly walked around the ice block. Shui Xiang had already sealed herself in ice. If there was no external help, she probably wouldn't be able to wake up for 3 to 5 years. The three of them worked together. Now that something had happened to Shui Xiang, the other two must have received the news. Since that was the case, then let's wait for the rabbit to appear. After a few simple words with his sister-in-law, Chun-Shi hung up the phone. Immediately after, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Chun-Shi sat cross-legged next to the ice block and silently cultivated. After a while, a green light swept over from the distant horizon. The man in green was called Qing Wan, so the one in white was obviously Bai Hong. Qing Wan was the first to return to the location of the strong light. Chun-Shi noticed his arrival, so he raised his head to look at the situation. But at this moment, Qing Wan's voice was like a thunderclap, resounding through the entire sky. "You're the one who hurt Shui Xiang?" His voice was very low, and there was a hint of anger that seemed to be on the verge of being unable to suppress. Chun-Shi raised his head slightly. Just as he was about to answer, Qing Wan suddenly stretched out his right hand. Immediately after, a long spear suddenly appeared in his hand. Seeing that Qing Wan was about to start a fight, Chun-Shi hurriedly waved his hand and shook his head to explain. "It's not me, it's the group of United States guys who did it." Hearing this, Qing Wan couldn't help but be stunned. He didn't seem to understand Chun-Shi's meaning, so a suspicious expression suddenly appeared on his face. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately struck while the iron was hot and explained. "The group of United States guys threw a nuclear bomb. This girl couldn't withstand it, so she turned herself into ice. Here, it's this." After that, Chun-Shi reached out and pointed at the huge ice block next to him. Qing Wan didn't speak. The expression on his face was a little uncertain. as if he couldn't figure out whether what Chen Shi said was true or false. So, after thinking for a while, Qing Wan flew down from the sky, and then carefully looked at the ice block in front of him. Nuclear bomb. Do you know about it? That's the most powerful weapon in the world. With a boom, it can erupt with a temperature higher than the sun. Then this girl became like this. Weapon? There is such a magic weapon in the lower realm? Why have I never heard of it? Qing Wan was completely frightened by Chen Shi, so he held the long spear in his hand and carefully observed the fluctuation of spirit nearby. Seeing this, Chen Shi smiled without saying anything. He was not teasing Qing Wan because he was bored, but because he wanted to use this opportunity to understand whether the connection between the three of them was close, and use this opportunity to find out if there was also a supreme magic weapon in the Heavenly Gate that could go back in time and explore the past like in the Heavenly Jade world. Judging from Qing Wan's reaction, the result was obvious. The connection between them was actually only to the extent of whether the other party was in danger. From this point of view, these ancient cultivators were even worse than soldiers on the modern battlefield. There was no spirit fluctuation on Chen Shi's body, so Qing Wan didn't take him seriously at all. Instead, he looked at all suspicious things around him. However, just as Chen Shi was about to repeat the same trick and take down Qing Wan in one fell swoop, a white sword light with shocking power fell from the sky and slashed directly at the position where Chen Shi was. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't panic at all. He grasped in the air and raised his hand. A green sword light went against the sky and collided fiercely with the white sword light in midair. The surging vital essence suddenly collided in midair, and the invisible shock wave even caused the ice below to separate and collapse on the spot. In an instant, the sword chi on the endless ice surface was crisscrossed, and ice chips shot in all directions, like a sudden polar ice storm. Chen Shi held the divine sword Dharma idol in his hand, looked up at the white figure in the air, and couldn't help but smile slightly. Chapter 290. His white robe fluttered as he floated over. Before the person arrived, the sword had arrived. Just like what Gulong described in the first sentence of the Sword of the Third Young Master. The sword aura spanned 30,000 miles, and the light of the sword chilled 19 provinces. Bai Hong was indeed as his name suggested. The moment he appeared, he was like a white rainbow, instantly taking away all the colors between heaven and earth, so that the entire world seemed to be left with only that white figure. However, when Bai Hong saw Chen Shi casually receive his sword strike, he didn't attack again. Instead, he suddenly lowered his head, saying to Qing Wan, who still didn't understand the situation, "From when we left until now, it has only been the time of a cup of tea. The Divine Gate is here." But Xue Xiang did not directly return to the Divine Gate. Instead, she chose to freeze herself here. "Qing Wan, what do you think? Why did she do that?" Hearing this, Qing Wan could not help but be stunned. After thinking for a while, he frowned and asked, "Why?" "Because she did not even have the chance to escape." Bai Hong slowly floated to Qing Wan's side. The two stood side by side, and then both of them looked at Chen Shi. Looking carefully, one could see that Qing Wan's eyes were full of suspicion and vigilance, while Bai Hong's eyes were full of surprise. "I did not expect that there would be such an expert in the lower realm. Changli, I'm afraid you have already killed him?" Changli. Hearing this, Chen Shi raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "Quite a poetic name, but I feel that this name does not seem to match his appearance." This seemingly nonsensical answer was actually an indirect admission of the matter. Changli had already died under his sword. He was the divine general that the elders had invited using the spirit binding formation. It had to be said that Changli was very unlucky. At that time, Chen Shi had not recovered from his injuries and needed to burn his blood essence to fight with him. But the consequence of burning his blood essence was, he did not control his strength, so Changli ended up without a corpse. Chen Shi had already said so much. No matter how slow Qing Wan was, he finally came back to his senses. If Bai Hong had not arrived in time, he was afraid that he would have been fooled by Chen Shi. Therefore, after being stunned for a moment, Qing Wan instantly roared at Chen Shi in anger. Just look at how angry he was. He looked like an enraged beast. He saw Qing Wan step forward fiercely. The long spear in his hand drew a starlight in the air. Then like a meteor, he shot straight to Qinshi. After this spear thrust, the long spear burst out a huge burst of qi. Like a high-speed rotating drill, the spiral qi energy blasted towards Qinshi while also sucking in the nearby air, so that there was a temporary vacuum between the two. It could be said. Of course, the divine general, rushed towards Qinshi with a great momentum. The qi that overflowed in the process of its advance plowed a huge gully in the thick ice surface. The spear was 13 feet long. The spearhead was slender like a reed leaf. The shaft was like wood but not wood. The entire body was indigo and carved with dragon patterns. The name of this spear was Starlight. Bai Hong, who was at the side, did not stay idle as the long spear struck. The moment Qing Yuan pounced, Bai Hong wielded his long sword and started to dance in the air. Strangely, every time he swung his sword, the long sword would leave a white mark in the air. In the blink of an eye, the air around Bai Hong was like glass, with countless scratches. Go. After a total of 108 strokes, Bai Hong suddenly turned the tip of his sword and pointed it directly at Qinshi. Then these scratches seemed to have received some kind of response and suddenly shot towards Qinshi. A long spear as fast as a dragon. 100 long swords as swift as rain. Facing the two aggressive attacks, Qinshi's lips suddenly curled into a smile. Then, under Bai Hong's slightly surprised gaze, the divine sword Dharma in Qinshi's hand suddenly turned into spots of starlight and drifted away. This is giving up on resisting? Even with Bai Hong's intelligence, after seeing Qinshi's strange behavior, he could not react in time. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The long spear came crashing down. But just as the long spear was about to pierce Qinshi's figure suddenly disappeared from Qing Yuan's eyes. Impossible. Qing Yuan's eyelids twitched, and he immediately wanted to withdraw his long spear. But this spear was used with all his strength. How could it be so easy to withdraw? Qing Yuan was like a bull that lost control, and instantly rushed to the position where Qinshi was just at. But then the scene in front of him completely changed. He was clearly still on the ice surface condensed by Shui Xiang, but in the blink of an eye, how did he come to a sea of fire? Qing Yuan held the long spear in his hand and looked around. It was all a sea of magma. The high temperature constantly evaporated the moisture in the air. After Qing Yuan held the long spear and looked around, he suddenly found that there was not even a bit of spiritual energy in this place. What exactly is this place? Qing Yuan was a little surprised, but at this moment, the magma below suddenly boiled. Then, a fire qilin suddenly jumped out of the magma, then stomped on the ground with its back foot, and bent its front foot slightly, and fiercely roared at Qing Yuan. Roar! If Nian was here, she would probably tilt her head and murmur in confusion. Papa, this big cat looks like a big cat. While Qing Yuan was in trouble, Bai Hong was also in a bad situation. Because he did not move randomly, Bai Hong did not directly fall into the array set up by Qinshi in advance like Qing Yuan, but it was precisely because he did not fall into the array that Bai Hong now needed to face Qinshi directly. And when he really faced Qinshi, Bai Hong finally understood what was called pressure. Just by standing there, this mysterious man made him feel an enormous pressure that was as heavy as a mountain and as deep as an abyss. Could it be Ming Yao's 4 sons were destined to die under this person's sword today? Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand. His hair and beard were all standing up, and he was ready for battle. But while he was on guard, Qinshi suddenly laughed. Wait a minute, there are mosquitoes. After that, Qinshi pointed his sword to the sky. A green sword light suddenly burst out, instantly rushed into the clouds, and then directly hit the United States reconnaissance plane that had been hovering in the cumulonimbus layer. Boom! Hearing the sudden explosion in the sky, Bai Hong's eyes flashed with a hint of hesitation. But after hesitating for a while, he still held the long sword in front of his chest, and then said to Qinshi seriously, My name is Bai Hong, and my sword name is Flowing Cloud. Please enlighten me. After his voice fell, Bai Hong's entire aura changed. If Bai Hong was more like a noble son who walked out of a painting just now, then now he was completely an unsheathed sword, exuding a sharp sword intent all over his body. Where the Tao exists, even if there are thousands of people, I will go forward. Chapter 291. I have a sword that can cut through people's hearts and ghosts. I have a heart that laughs on the road to immortality. The so-called swordsman did not cultivate the sword, but the heart. Since he held a 3-foot sword, he should be as upright as a sword, as unbreakable as a sword, as sharp as a sword. Only the sword, only the heart, only the self. Therefore, when Bai Hong held the flowing cloud sword and calmly reported his name to Chen Shi, his entire temperament changed completely, like a sharp sword out of its scabbard. Shiny, clear, and sharp. Invisible sword intent gushed out from Bai Hong's body, like a tornado that suddenly rose, expanding outwards with his position as the center. In an instant, small scratches appeared on the surface of the ice, as if someone had used a knife to scrape the surface of the ice. Seeing this, Chen Shi could not help but smile. From Bai Hong's performance just now, he had indeed touched the true essence of the sword. But unfortunately, Bai Hong had only reached the level of intent, and had not really stepped into the level of heart. If one had to use simple words to summarize, it would be, "Benefactor, you're thinking too much." The sword was just a weapon. As long as there was a sword in the heart, even if there was only a branch or a leaf in the hand, why couldn't it be a sword? When a swordsman no longer stopped at the surface, even if there was nothing in the hand, as long as the palm was straight, the palm could be a sword. The sword was not just a weapon. Of course, this kind of pure concept had nothing to do with cultivation, and could only be used to see if a person had the talent to learn the sword. Confucius said, "Those who are born with knowledge are superior. Those who learn to know are inferior." Chen Shi had seen a real genius in the way of the sword. He learned the sword at the age of 5, and had already understood the swordless realm at the age of no doubts. In comparison, Chen Shi, who took 500 years to understand the heart sword, was obviously not a peerless genius. Chen Shi did not seem to take Bai Hong seriously at all. When the term sword cultivator appeared in his mind, his thoughts couldn't help but drift further and further away. He even stood there in a daze. Bai Hong saw that Chen Shi did not respond, so she once again performed a sword salute, and then said with a solemn expression, "Please enlighten me." Towards this mysterious man who had defeated Chong Li and Shui Xiang one after another, Bai Hong clearly had to be 120% alert. The word Mr. clearly expressed his feelings at this moment. In this battle, he couldn't escape and he couldn't. The only way was to fight. Bai Hong's fighting spirit was overflowing, and the surging sword intent was like a basin of cold water suddenly poured on Chen Shi's head, making Chen Shi suddenly come back to his senses. "I'm sorry I got distracted. I don't dare to teach you anything. You can use your sword. I want to see your moves first. Maybe I can get some inspiration from it." Chen Shi smiled apologetically at Bai Hong. His tone was very casual, as if he was chatting with a friend. Hearing this, Bai Hong's expression was very serious. After bowing to Chen Shi again, Bai Hong pulled out a sword flower and shouted loudly, "If that's the case, then I'll offend you." As the voice fell, Bai Hong's figure suddenly flew into the air. As Bai Hong pointed the long sword in his hand, the long sword suddenly burst out in extremely dazzling light. Immediately after, a huge shadow of a divine sword faintly appeared around Bai Hong, and he himself was in the position of the sword hilt. This move is called hitting water. Please enlighten me, mister. Transforming feather hanging sky, tugging wind 90,000 shaking scales across the sea, hitting water 3,000. The first move of the Fuyao sword technique, hitting water. The huge sword shadow crashed down with a bang. At this time, Chen Shi held the divine sword Dharma form in his hand, and once again slashed out a green sword light. Perhaps it was because it was too hasty, but the cyan sword light seemed too small compared to the sword shadow formed by the white rainbow. As soon as they touched, the green sword light was completely swallowed by the white sword shadow. Without any obstruction, the white sword shadow crashed down. Boom. Like an intercontinental missile hitting its target, the surging true origin immediately caused a violent explosion on the ice surface. One had to know that because of the extreme cold in the water, the layer of ice that condensed on the surface of the sea was at least 10 meters thick. When the sword came down, it actually shattered the endless layer of ice into pieces. How was this still a missile? It was simply a comet hitting the earth. In an instant, the waves rolled and roared. The huge force caused the water below to spurt up to a height of nearly 100 meters. Looking down from the sky, one could see that the position where Chunshi was just at was the center of the explosion. The 100-meter-tall wave continued to spread out in a circular shape, wave after wave, and did not calm down for a long time. It could be said that it really lived up to the name of this move. Hitting water. Kuan-pung hitting water 3,000 miles. Bai Hong's move caused the surface of the sea to drop by nearly 100 meters. However, the sea had to calm down in the end. When the waves that were smashed by him gradually flowed back, Bai Hong frowned and flew out of the sea. Something was wrong. Just now, he had clearly locked onto that person's chi. And that person had not dodged, so this sword must have hit him. Then where was he? Bai Hong flew in the air and looked around, but he did not even see a shadow of a person. Could it be that that person was just a facade, and under his full-strength attack, he was turned into powder on the spot, and even his corpse could not be found? How could it be? Bai Hong frowned and looked around, but he did not detect any signs of spirit chi fluctuations. But at this moment, a crisp sound of palms came from not far behind him. Pa pa pa. Very good, accumulating strength and attacking with full strength. It is indeed worthy of my reference. But there is also a flaw, and that is that this move is actually not suitable as the first move of this sword technique, especially when the opponent's strength is on par with yours, or even slightly stronger than yours. This flaw will become particularly prominent. I don't know if you have heard of this saying. The fist is 30%, the leg is 70%. The fist is 30% of the strength, and the sword is agile, so naturally it is the same, so this move can only be used later, and is not suitable to be used at the beginning of the fight. Also, let me say one more thing. Such a wide-open move is obviously more suitable for your spear user friend. Am I right? Bai Hong looked back, only to see Chunshi appear behind him, unscathed. Looking at his relaxed and calm face, Bai Hong felt the pressure in his heart increase, and he almost had a feeling of suffocation. This person, is he a human or a ghost? What realm is he in? Why does he give me a completely unfathomable feeling? How is this possible? Bai Hong's expression was a little uncertain. At this moment, Chunshi suddenly smiled and said, "Oh right, that friend of yours who turned into ice was accidentally sent flying by you. Do you want me to bring you to look for him?" Hearing Chunshi's slightly joking words, Bai Hong felt even more pressure in his heart. But at this moment he seemed to have thought of something, and could not help but mumble softly, "Friend?" Following closely, Bai Hong seemed to have finally understood something, and fiercely withdrew his long sword, then said to Chunshi with a serious face, "So I have been under your control from the beginning to the end. Sir, you are indeed very capable." Chapter 292. I've learned my lesson. After saying that, Bai Hong acted out of character, and the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curl up into a faint smile. This kind of calm and relaxed performance was a world of difference from the solemnity he showed before. Then Bai Hong slowly withdrew his long sword under Chunshi's gaze, and then sat cross-legged in the air calmly. Looking at that posture, it seemed that he didn't want to fight anymore. Seeing this, the smile on Chunshi's face couldn't help but shrink a little. After seriously sizing up Bai Hong, Chunshi could only praise from the bottom of his heart. "You're indeed very smart, at least much smarter than your three companions. Sir, you flatter me." Bai Hong smiled slightly, looking like he had a card up his sleeve. It seemed that he had completely seen through Chunshi's little trick. In fact, from the time when Shuexiang froze itself to the time when Bai Hong and Qing Wan arrived, Chunshi was not idle at all. Using the ice that froze Shuexiang as the formation door, and using the gate of heaven that constantly devoured the surrounding spirit energy as the formation core, Chunshi cleverly used the materials on the spot, so he quickly set up a large-scale formation that seized the fortune of heaven and earth. Mind Confusion Array. Due to the limited conditions, this formation was mainly focused on trapping and disturbing. It did not have any offensive ability, and it could only be effective on enemies whose cultivation level was lower than the one who set up the formation. Looking at the current situation, this formation did indeed allow Chunshi to achieve his goal. But it was a pity, however. Bai Hong was much more intelligent than he had imagined. Just by the word friend, that Chun-Shi casually mentioned, Bai Hong was actually very sensitive to the fact that he might have fallen into Chun-Shi's trap. If he didn't break the formation, then Bai Hong would not be able to hurt Chun-Shi at all even if he exhausted all his strength. Because everything he saw now was an illusion. The reason why Chun-Shi had been using words to pressure Bai Hong was purely because he wanted to use them to break down Bai Hong's psychological barrier, so that Bai Hong would fall deeper and deeper, treating the illusion as real and wasting her true essence in the array formation for nothing. Once their Zhen Yuan was exhausted, Chun-Shi would be able to effortlessly take down the three of them in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, Bai Hong was not a reckless person like Qing Yuan. The feeling of being trapped in an illusion array was actually not much different from a dream. No matter how bizarre the dream was, the dreamer would not easily realize that they were just dreaming. Just like how Bai Hong didn't think about why Qing Yuan disappeared from her side just now. Therefore, only when the dreamer realized that they were dreaming would they be able to wake up from the dream. Thinking of this, Bai Hong emptied her mind and entered a meditative state. As expected, when he opened his eyes again, the scene in front of him had completely changed. The ice block that froze Shuixiang was floating on the surface of the sea, and Qing Yuan seemed to treat the ice block as an enemy, continuously launching wave after wave of fierce attacks at the ice block. Looking at the small cracks that kept appearing on the ice block under the attack of Qing Yuan, Bai Hong frowned. If he didn't guess wrongly, his water strike earlier should have hit the ice as well? The man in front of him actually wanted to use the two of them to break the ice barrier of Shuixiang. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone? How vicious and meticulous was this? The expression on Bai Hong's face was a little uncertain. Chun-Shi's despicable behavior really hurt his nerves. But the strange thing was, Bai Hong did not immediately flare up. After taking a deep breath, Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand tightly, and said word by word to the real Chun-Shi in front of him. Since Mr.'s strength is far superior to us, why don't you dare to have a fair fight with us? Hearing this, Chun-Shi couldn't help but laugh a few times. Although his method was indeed a bit disgraceful, it saved him a lot of trouble. Chun-Shi's head was not made of iron. Since he could easily outsmart them, why should he force himself to fight with these two people? Do they really think he's made of iron? Moreover, this kind of behavior was actually very common in the Tianqian sector. It was just that Chun-Shi had always prided himself as an outstanding young man in the new century, so when his little trick was exposed by Bai Hong, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He always felt that he was like Demon King Kuba in Super Mario, and Bai Hong and Qing Yuan were Super Mario brothers. The two brothers represented the righteous side and bravely fought against the evil Demon King Kuba in order to save Princess Shuixiang. Ashamed, Bai Hong waited for a while. Seeing that Chun-Shi had been silent, he suddenly changed the topic and asked with a bit of probing. I think, Mister, you have to keep us here today? Yes. At this point, Chun-Shi didn't hide anymore and simply nodded straightforwardly. Hearing this, Bai Hong asked in confusion. May I ask, Mister, what kind of deep grudge do you have with us? Why do you have to kill us all? Hearing this, Chun-Shi couldn't help but be stunned. This guy's tone. Why does it sound a little strange? Aren't Chongli and Shuixiang his companions? Chun-Shi first killed Chongli, then injured Shuixiang, but judging from Bai Hong's reaction now, these two people didn't seem to have as high a position in his heart as Chun-Shi thought. Chun-Shi was a little confused, so he didn't immediately reply. Seeing this, Bai Hong continued to say, I think Mr. also knows that it's not easy for us to cultivate to this point. So if I may be so bold, Mister, let us live. This guy was rather straightforward. Seeing that he couldn't beat Chun-Shi and couldn't escape, he actually directly begged for mercy. In the end, it was because there wasn't any irreconcilable hatred between them. From the moment he escaped from the formation, Bai Hong realized that he was no match for this mysterious man in front of him. Knowing that he couldn't win but still fighting with his life, this was definitely not a decision that a smart person would make. After all, death was the end of all troubles. Only by living would there be hope for the future. For an immortal cultivator like Bai Hong, who was more rational than emotional, this was indeed a very simple choice. This time, it was Chun-Shi's turn to have a headache. After all, he wasn't some cold-blooded demon king. Since Bai Hong had lowered his head and admitted defeat, then, should he kill him or not? Chen Shi seriously considered this question. Perhaps it was because he had been in normal society for a long time. The current Chen Shi was obviously more humane than when he was in heavenly spiral. But there was an old saying. Letting the tiger return to the mountain would cause endless trouble in the future. Therefore, after some serious consideration, Chen Shi came up with a compromise. How about this? If you can take one move from me, then I promise to let you live. How about it? As soon as he said this, Bai Hong couldn't help but smile. He hurriedly replied, "If that's the case, please enlighten me, mister." It was the same as before. However, Bai Hong clearly didn't understand what Chen Shi meant by one move. Until Chapter 293. The saber was just a very ordinary saber. The only thing that was surprising was that this saber was condensed from the Dharma form. Bai Hong originally thought that this mysterious man was also a sword cultivator, but he didn't expect that he would suddenly conjure a saber. Left hand holding a saber, right hand holding a sword. Because of the difference in level, Bai Hong had always been unable to accurately detect the fluctuation of spirit energy on Chen Shi's body. Until the appearance of this saber, Bai Hong finally noticed that there was a strong fluctuation of spirit energy on Chen Shi's body. Just the movement of spirit chi before charging up for a move gave Bai Hong a very strange feeling all of a sudden. Like a lonely traveler who came to the end of the world, looking at the sea and the starry sky. And Chen Shi was the sea, the starry sky. As vast as the sea, as deep as the starry sky. The moment the long saber appeared in Chen Shi's hand, the calm sea suddenly blew up like a typhoon. The spirit energy between heaven and earth seemed to be guided, and rushed towards Chen Shi's position. In an instant, surging, raging. Seeing this, Bai Hong couldn't help but change color, and hurriedly used the long sword in his hand to draw a sword flower, trying to calm himself down. This mysterious man had already promised him that as long as he could withstand this move, he would let the three of them live. Thinking about it, with the other party's strength, it should be impossible for him to go back on his word. Therefore, Bai Hong immediately braced himself and waited, gathering all the vital essence in his body into his dantian, preparing to use his trump card to receive the other party's earth-shattering move. Although his strength was definitely not as good as the other party, Bai Hong still felt that it was impossible that he couldn't even withstand one move from the other party, right? Thinking of this, Bai Hong couldn't help but look at the long sword in his hand, and a trace of bitterness appeared on his face. The blade was still shiny and sharp, but Bai Hong didn't notice it in his heart. He no longer had the indomitable momentum of a sword cultivator, because he was afraid. Fear before the battle. This was a big taboo. And just as Bai Hong was feeling uneasy, Chen Shi's voice suddenly sounded. "Your heart is in a mess. Do you want to have some time to adjust?" Hearing this, Bai Hong could not help but be stunned. After taking a deep look at Chen Shi, Bai Hong shook her head and said to Chen Shi seriously, "No need. Thank you for your advice." After saying that, Bai Hong gently exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. Then, under Chen Shi's slightly surprised gaze, she fiercely slashed her left hand on the sword. Blood immediately dyed the long sword red. However, the white rainbow seemed to be unaware of it. She raised her sword horizontally and recited word by word to Chen Shi. This move is called sun piercing. It is derived from the meaning of the white rainbow piercing the sun. There is only one move, please enlighten me. The comet attacks the moon, and the white rainbow pierces the sun. Anger has yet to be unleashed, but a truce has fallen from the heavens. If the warrior is enraged, 2 corpses will fall. 5 steps of blood. The world is in mourning. An extremely powerful aura suddenly erupted from Bai Hong's body. Even when facing Chen Shi, who was wielding both sword and saber, she was not at a disadvantage at all. Seeing this, Chen Shi could not help but nod in satisfaction. One must know that when Changli had faced the sword and saber dual mastery, his performance was not even as good as Bai Hong's today. The more intelligent a person was, the more afraid they were of death. However, Bai Hong was able to withstand this kind of pressure. She even managed to break through herself and forcibly bring out her peak state. Just based on this point alone, 10 Chonglis could not compare to her. Chunshi knew that cultivation was not easy, so he had always cherished talents. But regrettably, in order to give Nian and Yingying a stable environment, he had no choice but to keep Bai Hong and her party here today. He could not let them return to the Divine Gate. Come, as long as you can withstand this move of mine, I will let you go. After taking a deep look at Bai Hong, Chunshi finally raised the sword and saber in his hand. This was also the most powerful set of techniques that he had learned in his life, sword and saber. The second move. Sword splitting light, sword vanishing shadow, desolate killing, chaotic mortal world. As soon as the chaotic mortal world was released, Chunshi suddenly opened his arms and let the sword and saber in his hand fly out, circling in the air. Using chi to control the sword, using spirit to control the sword. The sword and saber flew faster and faster, leaving behind afterimages in the air. It was as if there were countless swords and sabers in the sky. At this time, Bai Hong felt that there seemed to be an incomparably sorrowful and desolate aura between heaven and earth. If he closed his eyes and carefully felt it, it would give him the illusion that he was on a battlefield. A vast battlefield after a great battle. There was no living person, only endless desolation, and the heavy coldness that death brought. This move could actually affect the minds of others? Thinking of this, Bai Hong could not help but shiver. However, he did not retreat at all. Instead, he gripped the sword in his hand tightly, and suddenly turned into a ray of white light, charging straight at Chunshi. There were no fancy moves. One man and one sword was enough. Even if there were thousands of people, he would still go. This was the white rainbow piercing the sun. The moment Bai Hong rushed out with the sword, Chunshi seemed to have noticed something, so he fiercely clasped his hands in front of his chest. Then, the thousands of swords dancing in the sky seemed to have received some kind of instruction. They suddenly gathered in front of him, and then spiraled into a sphere. The sphere carried a desolate and desperate aura, like the broken swords and sabers on the battlefield. Even if they were broken, they would still shatter everything in the world. The sphere formed by the sword and saber collided head-on with the ray of white light. The moment the two collided, the whole scene seemed to be frozen. Immediately after, an extremely violent explosion occurred. Boom! With the point of collision as the center, invisible energy waves continued to spread outwards wildly. In an instant, the wind and clouds surged and the sea waves surged. Like an atomic bomb exploding, the huge explosion made the sea water soar into the sky. Looking at the center of the explosion, one could see the colorful seaweed on the seabed. Even the sea was blown up. The power of one blow was so terrifying. Tons of sea water were blown into the air, and then turned into a torrent, pouring down from the sky. The crashing sound of the waves lasted for a full 5 minutes, and the vast Pacific Ocean finally returned to its previous state. Although the sea was calm, Chunshi's heart did not calm down for a long time. He floated in the sky, and the sword and saber in his hand had already dissipated. Sigh. After letting out a soft sigh, Chunshi raised his head and looked forward. Bai Hong was not far away, but his white cloak had already become rags, and it was stained with blood. Like a rag doll that had just been fished out of a red vat, blood kept coming out of Bai Hong's body, and then slid down his skin to the soles of his feet, and finally dripped into the sea drop by drop. Who would have thought that the bloody man in front of him, who looked like he had been executed by 1,000 cuts, was actually Bai Hong, who was said to be as beautiful as jade, as unparalleled in the world. Sir, good skill. Bai Hong. I've learned. Bai Hong opened his mouth with great difficulty. After saying these words in a voice as soft as a mosquito, he seemed to have lost all strength and fell limply from the sky. Splash. Scarlet blood dyed the sea red. Chunshi lowered his head and looked at the bubbles mixed with blood coming out of the sea. He could not help but let out a soft sigh again. Chapter 294. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The strong light was still suspended in midair, like the sun constantly emitting dazzling rays of light, trying to illuminate everything around it. Chunshi sat cross-legged in the air, only 2 to 3 meters above the sea surface, looking thoughtfully at the 2 spoils of war in his hands. One was Bai Hong's long sword, The other was naturally Qinghuan's long spear. The sword was named Flowing Cloud, and the spear was named Pointing Stars. The quality of the two weapons was not bad. Even in Chen Shi's eyes, they could barely be regarded as two offensive magic weapons. The so-called magic weapons were naturally treasures used by immortal cultivators, and usually had some kind of magical effect. For example, the azure wave silk gauze in Shui Xiang's hands, although it looked like a simple shawl, it had both offensive and defensive functions. When Shui Xiang was sneak attacked by Chen Shi, this long silk immediately turned into a defensive tool, protecting the seriously injured Shui Xiang, which also gave her another means of self-protection. Magic weapons were also divided into grades, according to their quality. They were divided by immortal cultivators into magic weapons, spirit treasures, supreme treasures, and the extremely rare innate supreme treasures. Most magic weapons were refined by immortal cultivators themselves. Just like forging swords, the craftsmanship of the craftsman and the materials used to forge the sword would affect the quality of the finished product. One had to know that the cultivation environment on Earth was so bad, it was naturally impossible to produce any high-quality magic weapon materials. Even the cleverest housewife couldn't cook without rice, without even the materials. Chen Shi couldn't make magic weapons out of thin air, right? Therefore, he could at most refine some simple magic weapons. Just like the pendant that he gave to Aunt Zhang before, it could help her block some dangers, such as car accidents, flower pots falling from the sky, and other unlucky things. But if Aunt Zhang encountered a bomb attack, the power of the explosion exceeded the pendant's tolerance limit, and the pendant would naturally lose its effect. Therefore, these two spoils of war were actually very valuable in Chen Shi's eyes. As long as they were broken down and recast, he could use these materials to create a suitable defensive magic weapon for Niannian. Although with Huaxia's public security, it was impossible for a terrorist incident like a bomb attack to happen. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Niannian was his treasure. If she was accidentally hurt, Chen Shi would never forgive himself. Therefore, Chen Shi weighed the spoils in his hand, and kept thinking about what kind of magic weapon he should forge for the little guy. Longevity lock? He was a child after all, so it was naturally best for him to wear a longevity lock. However, children nowadays matured early, especially girls. After a few years, would Niannian find the longevity lock ugly and refuse to wear it anymore? Chen Shi was a little conflicted. He was afraid that Niannian would not like it and throw it away. Why not make a jade bracelet? Or bracelets, anklets, and other accessories? As a father, he was constantly conflicted about how to please his daughter. But right at that moment, suddenly, an extremely strong fluctuation of spirit qi appeared in the strong light above his head. Chen Shi sensed something was wrong, so he quickly looked up. After looking at it for a while, he suddenly frowned. Something was wrong. Since this strong light was the so-called heavenly gate, then the current situation was somewhat like. He was watching television at home when a faint noise suddenly came from outside the door. Although the noise was small, it was enough to attract his attention. Therefore, Chen Shi immediately closed his eyes and carefully sensed for a while before finally confirming. There was someone behind the door. That person kept pacing back and forth outside the door, as if he wanted to cross the door very much, but for some reason, he was hesitating. It felt like a thief was checking if there was anyone in the house. Chen Shi did not want to expose himself, so he immediately restrained his aura and silently looked up at the strong light. At the same time, he held Bai Hong's flowing cloud sword tightly in his hand. The heavenly gate was a magical existence similar to a teleportation array. The inside and outside of the gate were connected to two completely different worlds. Although that person was outside the door, he could still affect the fluctuation of spirit qi inside the gate. What kind of terrifying cultivation was this? Relying on the fluctuation of spirit qi, Chen Shi secretly tried to figure out the other party's cultivation level. And the person outside the door seemed to be worried about something, so after pacing back and forth for a long time, he still did not cross the door. Chen Shi waited patiently. About 5 minutes later, a sudden change occurred. The strong light suddenly burst into a burst of extremely dazzling light. Chen Shi's expression turned cold. He immediately raised the long sword in his hand, ready to make the first move and catch the other party off guard. But at this time, the strong light suddenly flashed a few times, and then disappeared in an instant, as if there was a power outage. Without a light source, the world suddenly darkened. Thick dark clouds covered the moonlight, to the extent that one could not see his fingers in front of him. Even Chen-Shi could not see his surroundings clearly. Chen-Shi lit up a ball of light. Under his control, the ball of light slowly flew to the place where the strong light was before. But there was nothing left. Even the spirit chi that had been crazily rushing to the place where the strong light was now like a water ball that had been pierced. The spirit chi of heaven and earth that had lost its restraints suddenly dissipated in all directions crazily. In just a few breaths of time, everything had returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Only the sound of the waves was left between heaven and earth. Whoosh, whoosh. The waves slowly surged into the distance, one after another. Chen-Shi let out a long sigh of relief, finally letting go of his worries. With the closing of the divine gate, this matter could be considered to have come to an end for the time being. Now he only needed to clean up the mess and erase the traces that he had left behind. Then, even if the divine gate appeared again in the future, it would have nothing to do with him. Chen-Shi stood up and looked around. After confirming that there were no problems here, he was ready to leave. But at this time, he seemed to have noticed something and hurriedly looked up at the sky in the distance. Because the strong light disappeared, Chen-Shi couldn't see very clearly. It wasn't until a black shadow rushed out of the clouds that Chen-Shi finally saw the thing clearly with the light emitted by the ball of light. It was actually the trump card of the United States, the B-2 stealth bomber. The B-2 was known as the world's most advanced strategic bomber, with a cost of up to $2.4 billion US. According to the United States Department of Defense, every time the B-2 was deployed, it would cost at least $3 million US. Therefore, the moment he saw this guy appear, Chen-Shi suddenly understood something. This group of United States people, they were really as annoying as flies. Sure enough, when the B-2 flew over Chen-Shi's head, it suddenly opened the hatch and threw out two long objects. Chen-Shi looked up at the two objects thrown out by the B-2 and suddenly couldn't help but show a dumbfounded expression on his face. Just now, he was bullying Shui Xiang for being uneducated, and asked if she could withstand a nuclear bomb. This is retribution is here. Chapter 295. The B-2 was known as a stealth fighter, but it actually meant that it could avoid radar detection, not that it was actually invisible. Chen-Shi frowned and looked at the things thrown out by the B-2. He didn't need to think about it before he concluded that the two things must be nuclear bombs. It was not that he knew about nuclear bombs, but because as an Earthling, Chen-Shi was very clear about the morality of the United States. The United States, the world's recognized superpower, the world's overlord, and the Pacific Police. They drove nuclear-powered aircraft carriers all day long and naturally did not put any country or force in their eyes. Tonight's phenomenon appeared in international waters, and international waters had always been regarded as their backyard by the United States, so they wanted to join in the fun. There was nothing wrong with joining in the fun, but the mistake of the United States was, they didn't even understand the situation and they dared to directly fire at Shui Xiang. The consequences of doing so were imaginable. Under Shui Xiang's angry attack, a destroyer was gone, and an elite team equipped with exoskeleton armor was also gone. In terms of monetary value, the value of an exoskeleton armor was comparable to that of a destroyer, let alone a full combat squad. The Americans were infuriated by such a heavy loss, so they sent out another reconnaissance aircraft to investigate the situation. But just as the plane arrived, it was struck down by Chen-Shi's sword. The successive attacks finally exhausted the last trace of patience of the United States. Since they couldn't get it, they would destroy it, just like Mahang 370 back then. Simple and violent. The B-2's flying speed was very fast. After dropping the nuclear bomb, it turned around and was ready to leave. Seeing this, Chen-Shi couldn't help but sneer, then he waved the long sword in his hand toward the sky. Just like a charged weapon in a sci-fi movie, the long metal sword suddenly burst out with a dazzling light. Immediately after, a white light shot out from the tip of the sword. The white light cut through the night sky. An explosion suddenly sounded in the sky. Boom! In the blink of an eye, the B-2 had turned into a fireball and fell straight from the sky. That scene really had a different kind of beauty. Just as Chun-Shi hit the B-2, the 2 nuclear bombs had already landed not far above Chun-Shi. Seeing this, Chun-Shi suddenly raised his right hand towards the 2 nuclear bombs. It was like a traffic police officer making a stop sign. As soon as this gesture was made, the 2 nuclear bombs seemed to have been hit by a pause button and strangely stopped in midair. The 2 nuclear bombs weren't very big, only about 2 meters long. They seemed to be small nuclear bombs. One had to know that nuclear bombs were limited by their critical mass. It was usually easy to make a large one, but difficult to make a small one. Therefore, in the entire world, only the United States could produce a small nuclear bomb of this size. Chun-Shi thought for a moment, then tried to use his spiritual ether to destroy all the internal circuits of a nuclear bomb, completely turning it into scrap metal. As a highly educated person in modern society, Chun-Shi was well aware of the value of this thing. Therefore, he was prepared to give this nuclear bomb to the country as a form of repayment to his country. As for the other one, of course, give it back to someone else. After all, it was a traditional virtue of the Chinese people to return the money they found. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi used his spiritual ether to bind the 2 nuclear bombs, then quickly flew in the direction of the Okinawa Islands. The Okinawa Islands were known as the Ryukyu Islands in ancient times. Taiwan's ancient name was Ryukyu. Because of various historical reasons, the Okinawa Islands were now under the jurisdiction of Japan. This location was very special. It was only 600 kilometers away from the bay and 400 kilometers away from the Diaoyu Islands. Since the end of World War II, the United States had established a military base in the Okinawa Islands and regarded it as an important cornerstone of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. In fact, this military base with 50,000 soldiers had always been a sword of Damocles hanging over Hwasea's head. The United States fighter jets took off from the base and could arrive in Hwasea in less than 20 minutes. Therefore, this place was also called by the United States military the unsinkable aircraft carrier. When Chun-Shi flew over the Okinawa military base, the base was as bright as day. Soldiers the size of ants moved back and forth in the base, and many fighter jets were neatly parked on the runway, looking like they were ready to take off at any time. Looking at this situation, the base should be in a state of level 1 combat readiness. Thinking about it, even the nuclear bombs were taken out. Wasn't this a war? Chun-Shi originally wanted to throw down the nuclear bombs and leave, but when he saw the densely packed soldiers below, he still hesitated in his heart. Although everyone's skin color was different, they were still fresh lives after all. Maybe it was because he had been with Nian for too long. Chun-Shi did indeed respect life more than before. Therefore, after hesitating for a moment, he raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the runway below. The white sword light shot out from the long sword and became bigger and bigger in the air. When the sword light hit the airport runway below, it instantly left a huge gully like a moat on the runway. Boom! The huge explosion alarmed the entire base. The rapid ear-piercing alarm suddenly sounded, and the soldiers moved one after another, entering a state of combat as quickly as possible. At this moment, Chun-Shi's deep voice suddenly sounded from the sky. Chun-Shi's voice accurately reached everyone's ears, as if a god had come down to deliver a decree. I'll give you half an hour to organize a retreat. After half an hour, I'll use a nuclear bomb to destroy this place. I repeat, a nuclear bomb that you won't be able to intercept. So I sincerely advise you to cherish your lives, stay away from war and leave. In order to make these soldiers understand, Chun-Shi even used English, which she hadn't used in 500 years. It could be said that she was being extremely benevolent. As for whether they would listen or not, this obviously wasn't something Chun-Shi needed to worry about. Therefore, after throwing out these harsh words, Chun-Shi sat cross-legged in the sky and silently began the countdown. Half an hour. If they really wanted to retreat, with the reserves of this military base, it was actually a very easy thing to do. But to Chun-Shi's surprise, the soldiers in the base didn't have the slightest intention of evacuating. Instead, they entered a state of combat. In an instant, Dozens of combat aircraft flew out of the base. At the same time, many air defense equipment hidden underground were also activated, ready to launch at any time. Perhaps because the United States was confident in intercepting any nuclear attack, Chenxi waited for half an hour and didn't see anyone leaving the base, so he could only helplessly sigh. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it, and there's no door to hell, sigh. Chenxi didn't want to see the hellish scene, so he wrapped the nuclear bomb with his energy and quietly threw the nuclear bomb at the base. After that, he directly left with the 2 spoils of war and the nuclear bomb. Not long after he left, an earth-shattering explosion rang out as expected. Chapter 296. The aircraft carrier that claimed to be unsinkable sunk. In fact, Chenxi had always been curious about a question, and that was, could he resist the attack of a nuclear bomb with his body? Even a small nuclear bomb had a temperature of at least 50 million degrees Celsius at the center of the explosion. This temperature was actually equivalent to the surface temperature of the sun. The only difference between the two was that the sun could continue to heat up, while a nuclear bomb only had a short burst. However, the short moment of the nuclear bomb explosion was enough to melt all the cement and steel within a kilometer into liquid, and even vaporize it into gas invisible to the naked eye. The shock wave generated by the explosion would destroy all the buildings within a 3-kilometer radius. In addition, there was also radioactive pollution that would last for decades once it was leaked. Nuclear bombs were the crystallization of human wisdom. In terms of social status, they were at least comparable to innate treasures. Therefore, Chenxi was still a little uncertain about whether nuclear bombs could threaten him. After all, he couldn't run to the center of the explosion and use himself as a live experiment in order to verify whether nuclear bombs could hurt him, right? Then wouldn't he be a moron? Chenxi decisively put this problem behind him, and then returned to Zhonghai with another nuclear bomb. When Chenxi returned to Zhonghai, he found that Qin Shui had taken people to block the coastline, and even the estuary of Dianjiang overnight, prohibiting any people or ships from entering Zhonghai. Chenxi flew along the coastline. After finding the temporary command post built by Qin Shui on the beach, he threw the nuclear bomb down in front of Qin Shui's stunned expression. When Qin Shui finally reacted and chased out of the command post in a panic, Chenxi had already disappeared into the horizon. The next morning, when the little guy sat up from the bed with sleepy eyes, Chenxi and Qin Ruoying were sitting on the sofa outside, watching the morning news with relish. Because of the nuclear explosion accident last night, the media all over the world rushed to report it as if they were on steroids. As a result, this news spread all over the world in an instant, so now at least half of the people on Earth were paying attention to this matter. Finally, 2 hours after the accident, the White House spokesperson finally came forward to explain the cause of the nuclear leakage accident at the Okinawa military base. It was said that a certain staff member had made a mistake and caused an explosion in the laboratory, causing a series of chain reactions. First, it detonated the arsenal, then it set fire to the hangar next to it. In the end, even a nuclear submarine temporarily docked at the port for maintenance was affected, causing the nuclear reactor inside the nuclear submarine to malfunction and explode, leading to such a serious nuclear leak disaster. The Okinawa military base was an important part of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. Even during non-war times, there were at least 20,000 soldiers stationed in the base, but now, less than a tenth of the 20,000 soldiers survived. Even if some were lucky enough to survive, their bodies had been severely contaminated by nuclear radiation. Their future situation was definitely not optimistic. In terms of economics, because it was not a civilian facility, it was estimated that the economic losses caused by this accident were at least $500 billion. This number, it was almost close to the military expenditure of the United States for a whole year. In other words, the seriousness of this accident was no less than the Pearl Harbor incident during World War II. What annoyed the United States the most was, this nuclear bomb originally belonged to them. Throwing a nuclear bomb in the Pacific Ocean was not something that the United States, who had always liked to maintain world peace, would do. Therefore, even if the losses were huge, the United States could only swallow their pride. They had to conceal the truth of the accident, and forcibly make up a lie that could not stand up to scrutiny at all. As for what the truth of this matter was, and what kind of undercurrent was surging behind it, it was obviously not something that ordinary people could understand. The little girl sat on the bed and rubbed her eyes with her small hands. Then, like a kitten, she pouted and called out softly, "Mama." It could be seen that after this period of hard work, Qin Ruoying had successfully occupied a position equal to Chunxi in the little girl's heart. In the little girl's heart, Papa and Mama were finally on the same level. Qin Ruoying was now considered to have succeeded in qi cultivation, and the sensitivity of her 5 senses had been greatly improved. Therefore, after hearing the little girl's cry, she quickly ran into the bedroom and took the little girl to wash up. At this time, Chunxi went to the kitchen and brought out the 8 treasure porridge that he carefully cooked. A plate of delicious shrimp dumplings and a few side dishes. This was the little girl's favorite breakfast now. The couple served the little princess breakfast and accompanied her to recite a few ancient poems. Then they discussed today's itinerary. They had already been to their alma mater and met their classmates and friends. So, what should they do next? The couple was now like nouveau riche. They had a lot of money in their pockets. Just the bank interest alone was enough to make them comfortable, so they only needed to eat, drink, and play all day long. They were happy to be social parasites. Therefore, where to take Nian to play became a problem that they needed to struggle with every day. The two of them didn't struggle for long. Qin Ruoying's phone suddenly rang. The caller was Lin Xian. After yesterday's catching up, the revolutionary friendship between the two of them could be said to have been re-established. "Ying, I told Lele the news of your return. She was so happy. So, she asked me to ask you out today. She wants to have a good gathering in our dormitory." "Okay, where is it?" "Let me tell you first, I'm going to bring my husband." Speaking of this, Qin Ruoying very playfully winked at Chunxi. In the past, when their dormitory had dinner together, Chunxi was not qualified to participate. However, now was different. Her boyfriend had already become her husband. Naturally, Qin Ruoying would bring Chunxi. After hearing Qin Ruoying's words, Lin Xian on the other end of the phone did not immediately reply. She was silent for a while on the other end of the phone. Then, she coughed lightly and pretended to be calm as she replied, "Okay, don't show off your affection in front of me. You haven't met Lele's fiancé yet, right? Let her introduce him to you tonight. You have sharp eyes, so you have to help her interrogate him. Anyway, they haven't registered their marriage yet. It's not too late for Lele to back out now." Tui, what are you saying? Since they're already engaged, it must be true love, right? What's there to interrogate? I can't say too much about other people's matters. Because they were too close, Qin Ruoying did not shy away from joking over the phone. However, after hearing her words, Lin Xian did not seem to be joking at all. Instead, she said very seriously, "Ying, I'm serious. My woman's intuition tells me that Lele's fiancé is not simple." Oh. Hearing this, Qin Ruoying could not help but glance at Chunxi in confusion. Chunxi attended Fang Lei's wedding. With his sharp 5 senses, even without studying psychology, he was very accurate in judging people. Therefore, Qin Ruoying wanted to hear Chunxi's evaluation of this person. However, at this time Chunxi frowned slightly. Speaking of which, what was the name of Fang Lei's fiancé? If he remembered correctly, his name was Wang Shiwu? But why did this person not leave a deep impression on him? After all, Chunxi now had the ability to remember everything he saw. Therefore, he was very sure that this person had not appeared in front of him more than a few times. Chapter 297. The dormitory gathering that had been away for many years was set at 7 o'clock tonight, and the dining location was chosen by Fang Lei at a well-known high-end restaurant in Zhonghai. Lin Xian disliked her for being extravagant and wasteful, but she didn't expect to be choked back by Fang Lei's words. Everyone had graduated for so many years, they couldn't still go to a street food stall for the gathering, right? Lin Xian couldn't refute. Listening to Fang Lei's proud laughter on the phone, Lin Xian simply decided on the theme of tonight's gathering. Tonight's theme was, "Eat the Rich." The gathering didn't start until the evening, so the couple watched cartoons with the little guy at home all day. It wasn't until 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the family of 3 finally went out. When Chun-Shi walked out of the building with the little guy in his arms, the little guy was instantly stunned by the scene in front of him. He opened his small mouth and screamed, "Papa, look. The tree fell. And that one fell too." Because of Chun-Shi's meditation mantra last night, the little guy was in a deep sleep and didn't know what was going on outside. Last night's natural phenomenon made the people of Zhonghai experience the helplessness of a disaster. In the face of the wrath of nature, human beings were still too small. For Zhonghai, a place with good feng shui, earthquakes and tsunamis were big events that were enough to be recorded in history. Compared to the Okinawa nuclear accident that was far away, the natural disasters that the people of Zhonghai experienced were obviously more likely to attract social attention. Therefore, today's WeChat moments were basically occupied by the words earthquake, rainstorm, tsunami, and other words. All kinds of short videos about last night also rushed to the top of the trending list. Even those who were not in Zhonghai had a rough idea of how terrible last night was. Although the news had reported that the earthquake didn't cause any casualties, it still left a big shadow on everyone. For example, the trees that were blown down by the wind on the roadside gave people a feeling of lingering fear. Gongju residential area was an old residential area, so after the rainstorm, the problems in the residential area's drainage system were all exposed. The residential area did not hire a professional property management, so naturally, no one came to clean up the puddles. Therefore, when they left the building, the path was full of puddles. The deepest part was at least 4 to 5 centimeters thick. Chun-Shi had no choice but to hold the little fellow in one hand and hold Qin Ruoying in the other. The family of 3 stepped on the edge of the flower bed and slowly walked out of the community. The little fellow laid on Chun-Shi's shoulder and stretched out his head to look at the puddles on the ground. He immediately seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly hugged Chun-Shi's neck and acted coquettishly. "Papa, do a magic trick. I want to see you perform a magic trick." The magic trick she was talking about was obviously the magic trick Chun-Shi performed when he carried her to Kunming Lake at night. Walking on the water, a lotus blossomed with every step. As long as this kind of inhuman behavior was displayed in front of her once, as long as she saw a similar scene in the future, this little thing would naturally connect the dots. Hearing this, Chun-Shi smiled and said to her, "Daddy has already taught Mommy this trick. Let Mommy show you, okay?" "Okay." Seeing that the little fellow nodded her little head like she was pounding garlic, Qin Ruoying could only ask with a dumbfounded expression, "What trick? Why didn't I know that I could perform a magic trick?" "You can. Come on, I'll tell you." Then, Chun-Shi leaned over to Qin Ruoying's ear and briefly told Qin Ruoying about walking on the water. But when Qin Ruoying heard Chun-Shi's words, she put on a speechless expression. Seeing this, Chun-Shi gently squeezed his palm. Qin Ruoying said helplessly, "I'm not as capable as you." "Ying, try it. You can do it." After this period of cultivation, Qin Ruoying had successfully stepped into the late stage of qi refining, which was equivalent to a martial artist in the gang realm. It was almost the realm before Qin Xueqing met Chun-Shi. However, Qin Ruoying did not have the foundation of martial arts and had never fought with others, so she was not confident in herself. The reason why Chun-Shi asked her to perform a magic trick for Nian was to tell her a fact from the side. That was, she was no longer an ordinary person. However, Qin Ruoying was obviously not mentally prepared for this. Because Chun-Shi did not teach her magic, Qin Ruoying felt that there was nothing special about her except that her physical strength and 5 senses had been greatly improved. Ying, try to push the vital energy to your leg. Just like what is said in the martial arts movies. Calm down first, and then sink the qi into your dantian. Yes, that's it. Treat the water as the ground. Don't be afraid, step on it. Chun-Shi stood aside with the little fellow in his arms. Then, Qin Ruoying slowly stretched out her right leg toward the water under the gaze of the father and daughter. She was wearing a pair of flat shoes today. As soon as the sharp tips of her shoes touched the water, ripples immediately appeared on the water surface. There was no feeling of touching anything. Qin Ruoying looked at Chun-Shi with some doubts, but Chun-Shi just smiled and nodded to her, motioning her to continue. At this moment, the little fellow was also interested in the strange behavior of the couple, so like a good baby, she sat quietly in Chunxi's arms, and her big eyes stared motionlessly at Qin Ruoying's toes. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying suddenly laughed, and then directly stepped into the water. Anyway, the water was not deep, almost reaching the back of the shoes. As long as she tiptoed slightly, the water would not soak into her shoes. However, just as Qin Ruoying's left foot stepped into the water, the little fellow's exclamation suddenly sounded. "Mama is so amazing. I want to learn it too. Papa, teach me. Teach me." The little fellow clapped and screamed, and excitedly twisted in Chunxi's arms. "Nian, be good. This trick can only be performed when you grow taller. When you are as tall as me, I will teach you, okay?" "No." After hearing Chunxi's refusal, the little fellow suddenly pouted and looked unhappy. While the father and daughter were showing off their love, Qin Ruoying was still a little stunned. That feeling was very strange. It was like stepping on a plastic bag full of water. The water in the plastic bag was fluctuating, so her body swayed slightly. Qin Ruoying tried to withdraw her true essence. Sure enough, her body immediately lost its support and fell into the water, splashing a circle of water. "It's okay, Yingying, you are not familiar with it. Try again." Seeing that she fell into the water, Chunxi immediately comforted her. However, Qin Ruoying had a thoughtful expression, as if she did not hear at all. Then, in Chunxi's slightly surprised eyes, she took a step forward by herself, just as described in the Luo Shenfu. The light body stands like a crane, as if about to fly but not to soar. Walking on the path of pepper, the steps are thin but the fragrance is flowing. Seeing that Qin Ruoying walked on the water so leisurely, Chunxi could not help but be stunned. This was the first time Yingying used her true essence, right? Her comprehension, very good. Just when Chunxi was about to praise her, Qin Ruoying suddenly said thoughtfully, You said that you can push your true essence to your feet. Can you also push it to your hands?" After that, she gently waved her sleeves at the branch beside her. Then, in front of Chunxi's shocked expression, a weak true yuan directly hit the branch. Crash! Chapter 298. Looking at the branch that had fallen to the ground, Chunxi was so surprised that he was speechless for a moment. Although Qin Ruoying had been cultivating for a period of time, she was still at the stage of refining the heaven and earth spiritual qi, and diligently accumulating true essence. One must know that Qin Ruoying did not have any foundation in martial arts, so her ability to control qi in the air made Chunxi very surprised. After all, Chunxi had not taught Qin Ruoying how to use true essence. Today, because the little fellow was in the mood, Chunxi thought of letting Qin Ruoying try. He did not expect that Qin Ruoying's perception was so good that she could understand with just a little bit, and could even draw inferences about other things from one example. A falling leaf reveals the autumn of the world. A glimpse of a spot reveals the whole leopard. The so-called cultivation naturally paid attention to aptitude, bone structure, and perception. All three were indispensable. If aptitude and bone structure represented the body, then perception obviously represented the brain. After Chunxi's observation during this period of time, he found that Qin Ruoying's aptitude and bone structure were very ordinary. If she continued to cultivate according to her current cultivation speed, then Yuanying should be the limit that Qin Ruoying could reach in this lifetime. Maybe it was because she had lost her Yin soul before. Even after Qin Ruoying's 3 souls returned, her cultivation speed did not improve much. Compared to his sister-in-law, it was simply heaven and earth. This also made Chunxi subconsciously think that was Qin Ruoying's perception as ordinary as her bone structure? Because of this consideration, Chunxi did not teach Qin Ruoying those seemingly fancy little spells, but let her concentrate on refining qi, and refining qi, using all her time to refine the heaven and earth spiritual qi. As the saying goes, the clumsy bird flies first. As long as he was there, if he wanted to hurt Qin Ruoying, he would have to step over his dead body first. Naturally, there was no need for her to waste time learning any self-defense skills. However, Qin Ruoying's performance today was completely beyond Chen Shi's expectations. This kind of perception. I'm afraid that she can already catch up with me in the past, right? Thinking of this, Chen Shi could not help but look happy, and quickly stretched out his left hand and snapped his fingers. Pa! After a crisp sound, a weak flame jumped out of Chen Shi's fingers. Ying, why don't you try it? Hearing this, before Qin Ruoying could say anything, the little guy in Chen Shi's arms suddenly shouted excitedly. Fire! Papa can spit fire? Is this a magic trick? I want to learn. I want to learn. Papa, teach me. The little fellow was very excited. However, Chen Shi did not pay attention to her at all. In fact, this lighter was something that Chen Shi had shamelessly asked for from the taxi driver. There was no sign outside the mansion. Only 2 people wearing cheongsam stood outside to welcome guests. Qin Ruoying was not sure if she found the right place, so she called Lin Xian. Not long after, Lin Xian came out of the closed door of the mansion. Although they hadn't seen each other for a day, when Lin Xian saw Chen Shi's family again, her face still showed a very happy smile. Ying, Chen Shi, here, come in. Lin Xian greeted her. After taking the little fellow from Chen Shi's arms into her own arms, she smiled and said to Qin Ruoying, Ying, you're in for a treat tonight. This #1 mansion's reputation in Zhonghai is very good. Lele has to treat today, so don't be polite with her later. You must take advantage of her. As she spoke, Lin Xian led Chen Shi's family into the mansion. After all, it was an old building from the Republic of China. Although it was now converted into a restaurant, the restaurant owner deliberately kept some of the common Chinese and Western decorations of that era. It looked very unique. Fang Lei booked a table on the 2nd floor near the balcony. Lin Xian led Chen Shi's family to the 2nd floor. Fang Lei saw them at a glance, so she stood up and greeted with a smile. Ying, long time no see. Fang Lei's personality was somewhat similar to Qin Ruoying's. They were the kind of people who didn't show their emotions easily, so this simple greeting contained a lot of emotions. If the relationship between Qin Ruoying and Lin Xian was warm, then the relationship between her and Fang Lei was indifferent. Just as the old saying goes, the friendship between gentlemen is as indifferent as water. This indifference didn't mean indifference, but it meant purity and purity. The 2 of them held hands and chatted softly for a while before Qin Ruoying shifted her gaze to the man beside Fang Lei. Lele, let me introduce, this is my fiancé Wang Xiwu. Hearing Fang Lei's introduction, Wang Xiwu stretched out his right hand and said with a smile, Miss Qin, nice to meet you. I used to hear your name from Lele, and now I've finally met you in person. You're much more beautiful than I expected. Thank you. Qin Ruoying nodded. When she was about to shake hands with Wang Xiwu, Chen Shi suddenly appeared from the side. Then, under the slightly surprised gaze of Fang Lei and Qin Ruoying, he directly shook Wang Xiwu's hand. Chapter 299. Seeing Chen Shi emerge from the side with a smile, Wang Xiwu could not help but be taken aback. Is he not allowing his wife to shake hands with other men? To be honest, Chen Shi's action was indeed a little rude, and it would make him seem very narrow-minded. After all, it was a social occasion. Wang Xiwu wanted to shake hands with Qin Ruoying, who was meeting for the first time, only out of courtesy. But Chen Shi's reaction. Wang Xiwu was stunned for a moment, and he could only smile awkwardly. Then he turned to shake Chen Shi's hand. They were all friends, and Chen Shi had attended his and Fang Lei's wedding before, so Wang Xiwu naturally could not be angry over such a small matter. Mr. Chen, you're so lucky. Your wife is so beautiful, and she gave birth to such a cute and obedient daughter for you. I'm so envious. Wang Xiwu smiled and said a few polite words to Chen Shi. But after Chen Shi heard this, he looked at Wang Xiwu thoughtfully, then replied with a fake smile, Thank you. After that, he withdrew his right hand. Such an impolite behavior really made Wang Xiwu a little confused. Luckily, he had a good temper. If it were a hot-tempered second-generation rich kid, he would have flipped out and smashed the bowl. What kind of attitude is this? Chen Shi's behavior made the atmosphere a little awkward, and at this time, Fang Lei's voice suddenly came from the side. What Ying is beautiful, but I'm not. She glanced at Wang Shiwu with a smile that was not a smile. She put on a jealous look, which immediately livened up the atmosphere. Beautiful. Of course you're beautiful. Your dorm mates are all very good-looking. Hearing this, Wang Shiwu immediately laughed, and then went with the excuse Feng Lei gave him. Then, Feng Lei asked everyone to take a seat, and the topic finally returned to the three women. Qin Ruoying chatted with Feng Lei for a while. When the waiter came to ask if the dishes could be served, Qin Ruoying seemed to have thought of something. She quickly asked, "By the way, Xian, where's your boyfriend? Why don't I see him?" Hearing this, Lin Xian immediately explained with a smile. "He has to work overtime tonight, so he can't make it." "I'm sorry." "It's nothing, Xian. I was just asking." Qin Ruoying nodded. She and Chen Shi were both unemployed, so she naturally had to understand the difficulties of office workers, so she didn't continue to ask. "Where's Lulu? Didn't you call her? She said she would rush over as soon as she got off work. She should be here soon." Feng Lei looked down at the time on her phone, and found that it was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, so she turned to look outside the door. Sure enough, not long after her voice fell, two figures walked in from outside the door. One of them was Wang Lu, and the other, it was Li Xiuwen, who came uninvited. The moment she saw Li Xiuwen appear, Lin Xian frowned a little unnaturally. "Do you really think that Xian will be moved by your efforts to let Xian meet Li Xiuwen? Don't be stupid, okay? If you continue to interfere with Xian's feelings, we can't even be friends anymore." After saying that, Feng Lei went back to the residence angrily, leaving Wang Lu standing outside the door in a daze. It was a dormitory gathering, but she turned it into a failed blind date. The dinner ended in this extremely unpleasant atmosphere. Wang Lu drove back by herself. Lin Xian came by taxi, so Feng Lei offered to give Lin Xian a ride, but was rejected by Lin Xian. Qin Ruoying held the little girl's hand and stood beside Chen Shi. After watching Lin Xian get into the taxi and leave, she asked curiously, "Shi, what's wrong with you? I feel that you're a little weird tonight." Hearing that, Chen Shi smiled and shook his head. He held her hand and said softly in her ear, "I feel that something big is going to happen tonight. How about this? You bring Nian back first, I'll go check on the situation. I'll be back soon." Something big. Qin Ruoying was stunned for a moment, then a worried expression appeared on her face. Seeing that, Chen Shi smiled and touched her cheek. He comforted her gently. "Don't worry, I'm here." Although the cultivation method used by Bai Hong's group was very different from the immortal cultivation method that Chen Shi knew, the core of their cultivation was still qi refining. They still had to cultivate to be able to transform the spiritual energy of heaven and earth into their own use. This was the most traditional, and also the most reliable way of cultivation. If they were to be compared to the factions of the characters in wuxia dramas, White Rainbow's group could be called the righteous faction, and the person who created the evil cultivation method must be a big villain. It was impossible for the two to come together. Chen Shi frowned and looked at the contents of the secret book. He then turned to look at Wang Shiwu, who was sitting on the futon and cultivating. At this time, Wang Shiwu seemed to have noticed the strangeness in the room, so he immediately opened his eyes. Chen Shi. The moment he saw Chen Shi's figure, Wang Shiwu's body trembled violently. Obviously, he was shocked by the sudden appearance of Chen Shi. "Chen Shi, why are you here?" Wang Shiwu stared with his eyes and mouth wide open, looking at Chen Shi with a shocked expression. Probably because he was too shocked, there was even a blank expression on his face. This place was his biggest secret, but now it was unreservedly displayed in front of Chen Shi. How could Wang Shiwu not panic? You followed me? Seeing that Chen Shi didn't speak, a fierce light flashed across Wang Shiwu's face, and the temperament on his body suddenly became somewhat ferocious. Chen Shi stood not far in front of Wang Shiwu, looking at him condescendingly. Wang Shiwu usually wore a pair of gold-rimmed glasses and a tailored suit. He looked completely like a refined and successful person. But now, Wang Shiwu suddenly tore off that layer of disguise and completely showed his true side in front of Chen Shi. Chen Shi didn't speak. Wang Shiwu looked around in bewilderment. When he was sure that there was only Chen Shi here, his face suddenly showed a very strange smile. Very well, since you found out, then don't blame me for being ruthless. After that, Wang Shiwu suddenly jumped up from the futon and slammed his palm on Chen Shi's chest. Wang Shiwu's speed was very fast. The moment he made his move, Wang Shiwu's arms suddenly became like the roots of a tree. His blood vessels protruded, and a layer of dark brown spots and wrinkles appeared on his skin. It looked very strange. Wang Shiwu was Fang Lei's fiancé, and Fang Lei was Qin Ruoying's best friend. Logically speaking, he and Chen Shi were actually very close. What a pity. Wang Shiwu rushed at Chen Shi with a ferocious smile. Just as he was about to hit Chen Shi finally made a move. He suddenly raised his right hand, and like the action of smashing a ball in table tennis, he slammed his palm down heavily. Slap. If Chen Shi's hand was a table tennis racket, then Wang Shiwu's face was obviously a table tennis racket. Chapter 304. Rewind time to half an hour ago. After Lin Xian left in a taxi, Li Xiaowen, who had left early, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and followed Lin Xian all the way back to her neighborhood. However, Li Xiaowen did not follow Lin Xian into the neighborhood. Instead, he called Lin Xian from outside the neighborhood, implying that he wanted to talk to her face to face. He had pursued Lin Xian for many years, and this time he seemed to have finally thought it through. So he wanted to meet with Lin Xian one last time. They could chat as friends, and it could be considered as a farewell. From then on, he would not disturb her anymore. After hearing Li Xiaowen's heartfelt confession, Lin Xian was silent on the other end of the phone. She held her phone in one hand and pulled open the curtains with the other. In the hazy city at night, the flashing neon lights could not illuminate the deepest corner of her heart. At this moment, the scene was similar to what Huang Jingren described in Qi Huai. Sitting under the flowers and playing the flute, gazing into the distance through the red walls. As if this star was not last night, for whom the wind and dew stood in the middle of the night. Lingering thoughts are exhausted, turning the heartache and peeling the banana. 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 months, the pitiful cup of wine has not disappeared. The pitiful cup of wine has not disappeared. The bitterness of the world is no greater than the bitterness of infatuation. It had to be said that this kind of infatuated man's image could easily soften a woman's heart. Therefore, after much consideration, Lin Xian agreed to his request. She then went downstairs to Li Xiaowen's car to have a good talk with him. In reality, the reason why Lin Xian usually gave Li Xiaowen the cold shoulder was not because she really disliked Li Xiaowen, but because she did not want Li Xiaowen to waste too much time on her. Lin Xian was a rational woman, but at the same time, she was a kind woman. Because of this, she never gave Li Xiaowen a good look. She only hoped that he would back off in the face of difficulties and not take any chances. After all, after so many years, even if you raised a dog, you would still have some feelings for it. Moreover, was that still a human? But it was a pity. Lin Xian's heart already belonged to someone, and her attitude towards relationships was very extreme. She would never allow herself to compromise. As the saying goes, when one's heart is moved, it means that one is heartless. Lin Xian reluctantly got into the car. One had to know that ever since Li Xiaowen officially started pursuing her, Lin Xian had never sat in Li Xiaowen's car again. Therefore, when she sat in Li Xiaowen's car, she clearly felt uncomfortable. Lin Xian felt awkward, but Li Xiaowen was very excited. Chapter 305. Let me go. Let me go. Save me. Help. Save me. Lin Xian screamed as she used her nails to scratch at Li Xiaowen's arm. However, Li Xiaowen's arm was like a steel plate, and no matter how hard Lin Xian tried, it was futile. At the same time, because she used too much strength, she broke a lot of her carefully trimmed nails, and her fingertips started to bleed. Lin Xian's screams were very loud, but Li Xiaowen did not care, and dragged her like a sack towards the church. The church's door was not locked, and Li Xiaowen gave it a push, and the door slowly opened. Then he dragged Lin Xian into the church. But the strange thing was, it was nighttime, but the church that should have been closed a long time ago was brightly lit. The lights shone on the colorful window decorations on both sides, silently giving off a solemn and dignified feeling. Then this solemn atmosphere was broken by Lin Xian's screams. There was no one in the large hall, and Li Xiaowen dragged Lin Xian on the red carpet in the middle, and the commotion they made seemed to have alerted the church staff. Following a series of light footsteps, a figure walked out from the depths of the church. That person was about 40 or 50 years old, dressed as a priest, and had a cross pendant around his neck. He looked like the priest in charge of this church. Lin Xian made a lot of noise, but the priest acted as if he did not hear it. After he appeared from the passage, he went straight to the altar in the middle of the church, and then calmly looked at the pair of young people in front of him. Li Xiaowen dragged Lin Xian to the altar, and finally let go of Lin Xian's arm. Perhaps because she struggled too hard, Lin Xian was now completely exhausted, and so she laid on the carpet on the spot. At this moment, Li Xiaowen lowered his head slightly and said respectfully to the priest standing behind the altar, "Steward Sun, I want this woman to fall in love with me wholeheartedly and never leave me for the rest of her life. Sorry to trouble you." Hearing this, the priest who was addressed as Steward Sun took a deep look at Li Xiaowen, then asked calmly, "Just for a woman? Do you know what price you have to pay? You only have one chance. You'd better think carefully before answering me." After hearing Steward Sun's words, Li Xiaowen hesitated for a moment. But when he looked at Lin Xian who was lying beside him, he fiercely gritted his teeth and solemnly nodded in response. "I know. I have no regrets. Manager Sun, sorry to trouble you." "Very good. The Heavenly Father has heard your words. Now it is time for you to listen to the gospel." The priest nodded. Then he raised his right hand and pointed his index finger at Lin Xian. At this moment, Lin Xian was like an injured rabbit. She could only kneel on the ground weakly. She tried her best to distance herself from Li Xiaowen, but at this moment, an invisible force suddenly surrounded her.